She had left behind the only laboratory she had ever called home, the city that had shaped her entire adult life, and the colleague who knew her mind better than anyone else alive. Yet the letter that arrived in her small Swedish room would prove that some discoveries refused to respect borders or exile. Lise Meitner had spent more than 30 years working side by side with Otto Hahn in Berlin. Their partnership had become something rarer than friendship. It was a quiet, wordless understanding that let them finish each other's sentences in the lab and anticipate each other's doubts before they were spoken. She was the physicist who could see the invisible paths of particles. He was the chemist who could coax those particles into revealing themselves. Together they had mapped entire new regions of the periodic table, and their names were spoken with respect in every serious laboratory across Europe. But respect could not protect her from the world that was closing in. By the summer of 1938, the Germany she had loved had become a place where a woman of Jewish ancestry could no longer hold a university position, could no longer walk into her own institute without fear, could no longer be certain that tomorrow would not bring another decree stripping away one more piece of her life. Colleagues who had once greeted her warmly now crossed the street. Some did so out of genuine hatred, others out of the smaller, colder calculation that being seen with her might cost them their own careers. Yet Hahn never wavered. He continued to meet her in the laboratory as though nothing had changed, even as the walls around them grew higher and the air grew thinner. When the order finally came that she must leave the country, it was Hahn who helped arrange the details, who made certain she had the papers she needed, who walked with her to the train that would carry her across the border into Holland and then on to Sweden. There were no dramatic speeches between them. Only a long handshake at the platform and the understanding that their work, at least, would continue through letters. In Stockholm the winter came early and stayed late. Meitner found a small room and a modest laboratory at the Nobel Institute, but the work felt strangely weightless without Hahn's presence across the bench. She wrote to him often, long letters filled with scientific questions and the smaller, human details she could not share with anyone else, the way the Swedish light never seemed to reach the bottom of the sky, the ache of missing the familiar sounds of the Berlin Institute. Hahn wrote back with equal steadiness, describing experiments he was running with his new colleague Fritz Stresemann, a quiet, meticulous man who shared their hunger for understanding. They were bombarding uranium with neutrons, expecting to create slightly heavier elements, the usual next step in their patient mapping of the atomic world. Instead, the results kept refusing to make sense. The letter that changed everything arrived on a gray afternoon when the snow had already begun to fall again. Hahn's handwriting was careful, almost hesitant, as though he were still trying to believe what his own hands had shown him. They had found not a heavier element but barium, something much lighter, something that could only have come from the uranium nucleus breaking apart. He asked her, almost pleaded with her, to help him understand what he had seen. Meitner read the letter twice, then a third time, sitting very still in her small room while the light faded outside. She knew immediately that this was not a mistake in the chemistry. Something far more fundamental had occurred. Her nephew Otto Frisch was visiting for the holidays, and on the day after the letter arrived they went for a walk in the woods outside Stockholm. The snow was deep and untouched, the only sound the soft crunch of their boots and the occasional call of a bird. They walked in silence for a long time, each turning the problem over in their minds. Eventually they stopped beside a fallen log, brushed the snow from it, and sat down. Frisch pulled a notebook from his coat. Meitner began to speak, slowly at first, describing what Hahn had found and what it might mean. As they talked, the pieces began to lock together with a clarity that was almost frightening. The uranium nucleus, struck by a single neutron, had become so unstable that it had split into two lighter nuclei. In the process it had released an enormous amount of energy, far more than any chemical reaction could ever produce, because a tiny fraction of its mass had been converted directly into energy. They worked the numbers on the page, their gloved fingers clumsy with cold, and the result kept coming out the same. The energy released by even a single splitting nucleus was immense. And if that splitting released additional neutrons, those neutrons could strike other uranium nuclei and split them in turn. A chain reaction. A self-sustaining release of energy that could, in theory, continue until every available nucleus had been transformed. Frisch looked up from the notebook. His face was pale against the snow. "If this is true," he said quietly, "then it changes everything." Meitner did not answer at once. She was thinking of the letters she had received from friends still in Germany, of the families who had already disappeared, of the speeches she had heard on the radio that spoke of a 1,000-year empire built on conquest and fear. She thought of the power now sitting in their hands, not as a weapon yet, but as a possibility that could not be unseen. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but low. "We have to be very careful with what we say next," she told her nephew. "Because once this is known, it cannot be unknown." They gave the process a name that afternoon, fission, borrowing the word biologists used for the division of a living cell. It felt oddly appropriate. Something that had been whole had divided, and in dividing it had released the energy that held it together. They wrote a short paper together and sent it to the journal Nature. Within weeks, physicists across Europe and America were repeating the experiment and reaching the same conclusion. The whisper that had begun in a Berlin laboratory had become a conversation that could no longer be contained. Back in Germany, Hahn continued his work even as the political pressure around him grew heavier. He wrote to Meitner whenever he could, his letters carrying both the excitement of new results and the growing weight of what those results might mean for a world that was sliding toward open war. He never asked her to return. He knew it was impossible. Instead, he asked her to keep thinking, to keep writing, to remain the conscience of their shared work even from a distance. She answered every letter, sometimes late into the night, sometimes with tears on the page that she did not mention. Their correspondence became a lifeline stretched across a darkening continent, two people who had spent their lives measuring the smallest pieces of matter now measuring, together, the moral size of what they had uncovered. Other scientists began to hear the news in their own laboratories. Some reacted with the pure excitement of discovery, others felt the same cold apprehension that had settled over Meitner and Frisch on that snowy log. A few wrote to colleagues in America, where the political climate still allowed open discussion. The questions they asked were no longer only scientific. There were questions about responsibility, about whether knowledge this powerful could ever remain the property of a single nation, about what it would mean if the first government to master it was the one that had already driven Meitner from her home. In the quiet of her Swedish room, Meitner often sat with Hahn's letters spread before her and wondered what they had set in motion. She had spent her entire life believing that the pursuit of understanding was a good in itself. Now she was no longer certain. The atom had yielded its secret not because anyone had forced it, but because patient, curious people had kept asking the next question. Yet the world that would receive that secret was not a patient or curious world. It was a world of marching armies and burning synagogues and leaders who spoke openly of domination. The courage it had taken for Meitner to keep thinking clearly when everything around her was designed to make thinking impossible, and the courage it had taken for Hahn to continue their work even while living inside the machinery of that darkness, those were the kinds of quiet, stubborn courage that history rarely records in full. They were the courage of people who refused to let fear or exile or political pressure silence the questions that mattered most. Just as these scientists in exile and under pressure showed extraordinary courage in the face of impossible odds and a world sliding into global conflict, there are powerful stories from that same war that still have the power to move us and to help us remember what was truly at stake. If you want to honor the human cost and the quiet heroism of those years in a way that stays with you long after the screen fades, I can't recommend highly enough the gripping film Midway, available on Prime Video, along with authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a tangible piece of that history. These are the kinds of resources that connect us directly to the courage and sacrifice of an entire generation. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What Meitner and Hahn could not know on that snowy afternoon was how quickly their discovery would travel, how many other laboratories would race to understand it, And how soon the question would shift from whether such a weapon could be built to who would build it first. The whisper that had split the atom had already begun to echo in places far from Berlin and Stockholm. And the people who would eventually answer that echo were only just beginning to understand the weight of what they were being asked to carry. In a modest summer house overlooking the water on Long Island, Albert Einstein listened while a fellow refugee physicist explained why the most famous man in the world needed to sign a letter that might help unleash the most destructive force humanity had ever conceived. Leo Szilard had not slept well for weeks. He carried the knowledge like a stone in his coat pocket, the knowledge that the atom could be split, that the neutrons released in that splitting could trigger others, and that an entire city could one day vanish in a single blinding flash. He had seen the possibility years earlier, standing on a London street corner in 1933, when the idea of a self-sustaining chain reaction had arrived in his mind with such force that he had stopped walking and simply stood there while traffic moved around him. At the time he had filed a patent to keep the idea secret, already fearing what governments might do with it. Now the fear had a name and a face: Adolf Hitler's Germany, where colleagues he had once debated with in Berlin cafes were being driven from their posts or worse. Szilard had reached America with little more than his notebooks and a growing sense of urgency. In the university laboratories where he found temporary work, he tried to make others see what he saw. Enrico Fermi, newly arrived from Italy, listened politely and then returned to his own careful experiments with graphite and uranium. Ernest Lawrence in California was building his cyclotron and thinking about medical uses for radioactive materials, not weapons. Szilard wrote letters, made phone calls, traveled by train between cities, always carrying the same quiet, relentless message: the Germans might already be working on this. If they succeeded first, the war that was clearly coming would be over before it began. Most people heard him and nodded and went back to their own work. A few grew angry, telling him he was exaggerating, that no government would ever fund something so speculative and so terrible. Szilard kept moving. He had learned in his own life what happens when people wait too long to act. The decision to approach Einstein came after another long night of pacing in a small rented room. Szilard knew that his own name carried no weight with the American government. He was a foreigner, a Jew who had fled first Hungary and then Germany, a man without a permanent university position or influential friends in Washington. But Einstein's name was known even to people who had never studied physics. If Einstein signed a letter, someone in the White House might actually read it. The problem was that Einstein had spent much of his public life arguing against militarism and for international cooperation. He had left Germany in 1933 partly because he refused to live under a regime that glorified war. Asking him to help push for a new and more terrible weapon felt like asking a man to betray the very principles that had made him leave everything behind. Szilard did not go alone. He asked Eugene Wigner, another Hungarian refugee physicist who had also found shelter in America, to drive with him to Long Island. They borrowed a car and made the journey on a warm summer day when the roads were quiet. In the car they rehearsed what they would say, though both knew that Einstein would see through any rehearsed speech in seconds. Wigner drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, while Szilard stared out the window and tried to find the right words for something that had no right words. They were about to ask one of the gentlest men they knew to help open a door that might never be closed again. Einstein's summer house was small and unpretentious, the kind of place a man goes when he wants to think without being watched. He greeted them at the door in a rumpled sweater, his white hair uncombed, his pipe already lit. He did not seem surprised to see them. Refugees learned to recognize one another quickly, and Einstein had been following the news from Europe with the same sick feeling that Szilard carried. They sat at a wooden table near a window that looked out over the water. For a while they talked about old friends still trapped in Germany, about letters that had stopped arriving, about the small acts of courage they had heard of, a colleague who had hidden someone's children, a former student who had refused to sign a loyalty oath. These were the stories that refugees told one another when they needed to remember that not everyone had surrendered to fear. Then Szilard began to speak about the letter. He described what Hahn and Meitner had discovered, what he and Fermi had confirmed in their own laboratories, and what it would mean if a chain reaction could be made to grow inside a large enough mass of uranium. He did not use technical language. He spoke instead of a fire that could feed itself, a process that once started might continue until nothing remained to burn. Einstein listened without interrupting, his face growing still. When Szilard finished, Einstein was quiet for a long time. He got up, walked to the window, and stood with his back to them, looking at the water. When he turned around again, his eyes were tired in a way Szilard had not seen before. "I have always believed," Einstein said slowly, "that scientists should not place new powers into the hands of governments until those governments have shown they can be trusted with them. But we are no longer living in that kind of world." He sat down again. "If there is even a chance that the Germans are working on this, then we have no choice. We must tell someone who can act." He agreed to sign the letter, but he asked Szilard to write it. Einstein did not want his own words to sound like a call to arms. He wanted the letter to be careful, factual, and above all urgent without being hysterical. Szilard nodded. He had already drafted several versions in his mind during the long nights when sleep would not come. They worked on the letter that afternoon and into the evening. Szilard wrote while Einstein read over his shoulder, suggesting small changes in phrasing that made the warning feel more like a duty than a threat. They discussed whether to mention the possibility of a bomb or to speak only of a powerful new source of energy that could be used for good or for destruction. In the end, they chose the more direct language. There was no point in softening what they knew. They also decided not to send the letter through ordinary mail. It needed to reach the president himself, and it needed to reach him quickly. They asked Alexander Sachs, an economist who had the president's ear and who understood the stakes, to carry it personally to the White House. Sachs read the letter several times before he agreed. He was not a physicist, but he had spent enough time with scientists to recognize when they were speaking from genuine fear rather than excitement. He arranged a meeting with Franklin Roosevelt and carried the letter in his briefcase through the corridors of power. The meeting lasted longer than anyone expected. Roosevelt listened while Sachs read the letter aloud, then asked questions that showed he understood the implications immediately. He did not need diagrams or equations. He needed to know whether the danger was real and whether America could afford to ignore it. When Sachs finished, Roosevelt was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the men in the room and said simply that this required action. He asked his aide to begin the process of bringing the right people together. The sleeping giant had stirred, though it would still be many months before it truly woke. For Szilard, the relief was mixed with a deeper unease that never left him. He had succeeded in moving the most powerful man in the country to pay attention, yet he could not escape the knowledge that he had helped set in motion a chain of events whose end he could not see. In the weeks that followed, he continued to push, to write more letters, to meet with military officers who still thought the whole idea was science fiction. Sometimes he would sit alone in his room and wonder whether Einstein had been right to sign, whether there had been another path that did not lead toward a weapon. He never found a comfortable answer. The only thing that felt certain was that doing nothing would have been worse. Einstein carried his own private burden. He had come to America to escape the very militarism he now found himself supporting, however indirectly. In later years he would speak of the letter with a mixture of necessity and regret, always returning to the same point: he had acted because the alternative, allowing the most destructive regime of the age to possess such power alone, was unthinkable. The moral weight of that choice stayed with him long after the letter had done its work. He had spent his life trying to understand the universe. Now he had helped place a new and terrible understanding into the hands of governments that might not prove wise enough to carry it. Other refugee scientists watched what Szilard and Einstein had done and felt the same mixture of relief and dread. They wrote their own letters, held their own quiet meetings, tried to prepare themselves for the work that might soon be asked of them. Some of them had left behind wives and children who could not yet get exit visas. Others had watched colleagues disappear into camps. They knew better than most Americans what was already happening in Europe, and they knew that knowledge this powerful would not remain theoretical for long. The letter had been a beginning, but it was only a beginning. The real test would come when the sleeping giant finally opened its eyes and decided what kind of weapon it was willing to build. The decision these men made that day was born from the harsh realities they had already witnessed, friends and colleagues driven from their homes, the rising machinery of persecution that would soon engulf a continent, and the terrible knowledge that some governments would stop at nothing to dominate the future. Those realities, the ones too brutal and too personal for many official histories to show in full, are preserved in collections of raw, uncensored photographs and footage that capture the true face of what was at stake for the people who lived through it. If you want to see the unfiltered human cost behind the decisions that shaped the war, there is a powerful digital collection available that brings together images and film the platforms we usually rely on will never show. It is the kind of record that helps us understand why men like Szilard and Einstein felt they had no choice but to act. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the months after the letter reached the White House, small committees began to form, modest funds were quietly allocated, and a handful of scientists were asked to begin serious work on the problem of chain reactions. The process was slow, cautious, and often frustrating for those who had seen the danger earliest. But something had changed. The United States had been told, in language it could not easily dismiss, that the world had entered a new and more dangerous age. The men who had delivered that message would spend the rest of their lives living with what they had set in motion. Some would come to believe they had helped prevent a greater catastrophe. Others would wonder, until the end of their days, whether there had been another way to protect the future without arming it with fire. The letter had done its work. Now the harder work of deciding what kind of people would carry that fire was about to begin. In a basement laboratory at Columbia University, Enrico Fermi and a small team of men worked late into the night, adjusting instruments and recording faint clicks that might one day decide whether their adopted country would survive the war that was already swallowing Europe. The letter Einstein had signed had reached the White House and stirred a response, but the response was cautious and small. A committee was formed to study the possibilities, and at its head sat Lyman Briggs, a careful, methodical man who had spent his career at the National Bureau of Standards measuring things with precision and patience. Briggs believed in evidence before action, and thorough reports before bold requests. He had been given a modest budget and a handful of scientists who already carried the weight of exile or the memory of what they had left behind. To the men who had watched their colleagues driven from laboratories in Germany and Italy, the pace felt dangerously slow. To Briggs, it felt responsible. Between those two views stretched the early, frustrating months of what would later be called the Uranium Committee. Fermi had arrived in America with his wife Laura and their 2 children only months earlier. He had left Italy after Mussolini's government passed racial laws that made it impossible for Laura, who was Jewish, to continue her life there without fear. Fermi himself was not Jewish, but he had refused to work under a regime that punished families for who they were. They had come to New York with little more than their suitcases and the knowledge that Fermi's reputation as one of the world's leading physicists gave them a chance at a new beginning. He accepted a position at Columbia and immediately set to work on the problem that had followed him across the ocean, whether a chain reaction could be made to sustain itself in uranium. The laboratory was nothing like the grand institutes he had known in Rome. It was a basement room with thick walls and poor ventilation, filled with graphite blocks that left black dust on every surface and on the men who handled them. Fermi worked with a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller and more focused. He spoke little during experiments, preferring to watch the instruments and let the data speak. Around him were a few graduate students and a colleague named Herbert Anderson, a young American physicist who had quickly become Fermi's closest collaborator in the new country. They spent hours stacking graphite and uranium in different arrangements, measuring how neutrons behaved when they passed through the material. Some neutrons were absorbed, some bounced back, and a very small number caused the uranium to split and release more neutrons. The goal was simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to achieve: to find a configuration where the number of neutrons produced was at least as large as the number consumed. If that multiplication factor could be made greater than 1, a chain reaction could grow. Fermi rarely showed excitement in the lab, but on the nights when the instruments registered a multiplication factor that inched closer to 1, the men allowed themselves a moment of quiet satisfaction. They would stand together in the dim light, graphite dust on their hands and faces, and speak in low voices about what it would mean if they succeeded. Anderson once asked Fermi what he thought would happen if they actually achieved a self-sustaining reaction. Fermi looked at the pile of blocks and answered with characteristic calm that the world would change, though he did not say whether he believed the change would be for good or for ill. The question hung in the air between them. They were building something that had never existed on Earth, and they were doing it with equipment that looked more like a child's fort than a weapon of war. While Fermi worked in the basement, Leo Szilard moved through the corridors of Columbia and traveled to other universities, carrying the same urgency he had brought to Einstein's door. Szilard had no permanent laboratory of his own at first. He lived on grants and temporary positions, always aware that his refugee status made him dependent on the goodwill of others. He attended every meeting of the Uranium Committee and often found himself frustrated by the careful pace Briggs preferred. Briggs wanted more measurements, more reports, more certainty before asking for larger resources. Szilard wanted action before it was too late. He had seen what happened when governments moved too slowly. In private conversations with Fermi and Anderson, he expressed his fear that German scientists were already further along, that the same regime that had driven him and so many others from their homes might be the first to harness this new power. Fermi listened and continued his experiments. He respected Szilard's passion but believed that careful science would ultimately serve the project better than hurried requests. Ernest Lawrence watched from Berkeley, California, where he had built his cyclotron into a powerful tool for exploring the nucleus. Lawrence was an optimist by nature, a man who believed that American ingenuity and engineering could solve almost any problem if given enough resources and freedom. When he learned of the fission work and the committee's cautious approach, he wrote letters and made phone calls, arguing that electromagnetic separation of uranium isotopes might offer a faster path than the slow chemical methods being considered. He offered his laboratory's expertise and his own considerable reputation. Lawrence's enthusiasm sometimes clashed with the more measured tone of the committee, but it also kept the possibility of rapid progress alive in the minds of those who read his reports. He had not yet been asked to join the inner circle of decision-makers, but his voice carried weight because he had already shown what focused American effort could achieve. The meetings of the Uranium Committee often took place in Washington or New York in rooms that felt too formal for the revolutionary ideas being discussed. Briggs would sit at the head of the table, listening carefully as Fermi described neutron multiplication factors or as Lawrence outlined the potential of his separation method. Military representatives attended some sessions, men in uniform who asked practical questions about how long it would take to produce results and what those results might actually be used for. Their skepticism was not hostility, it was the caution of men who had seen many promising ideas fail when they moved from the laboratory to the battlefield. Szilard sat through these meetings with growing impatience, sometimes speaking too forcefully and then regretting the tone later. After one particularly difficult session, he wrote a long letter to a colleague in which he described the feeling of watching the clock tick while the men who controlled the resources asked for one more study. He did not send the letter. Instead, he folded it and placed it in a drawer, then returned to the work of convincing people one conversation at a time. There were small moments of kindness that kept the group moving forward. Fermi's wife Laura often prepared meals for the young men who worked late in the basement, bringing food to the laboratory when the experiments ran past dinner. Anderson remembered those evenings as the times when the weight of what they were attempting felt lightest, when they could speak not only of neutrons and multiplication factors but of their families, their hopes for the future, and the ordinary lives they were trying to protect. Briggs, despite his caution, quietly approved additional graphite when Fermi explained why a larger pile might give clearer results. Lawrence sent detailed technical notes from California without being asked, sharing ideas that might help the Columbia team move faster. These were not grand gestures. They were the everyday acts of people who understood that the work was larger than any single laboratory or any single personality. The emotional cost of those early months was carried most heavily by the refugees among them. Fermi had left behind colleagues and students in Italy who now lived under increasing pressure. Szilard received letters from friends still in Europe describing arrests and disappearances, letters that arrived weeks late and sometimes stopped altogether. They worked with the knowledge that every month of delay might mean the difference between America possessing this new power and Germany possessing it alone. At the same time, they carried the private fear that success might bring its own terrible consequences. Fermi once told Anderson that he hoped they would discover the chain reaction was impossible, because that would remove the burden of having to decide what to do with it. Anderson did not answer. He knew Fermi did not truly believe the reaction was impossible. He was simply giving voice to the doubt that lived alongside the determination in every member of the group. As the first winter of the committee's work gave way to spring, Fermi's team achieved a modest but important result. In a carefully arranged pile of graphite and uranium, they measured a multiplication factor that, while still less than 1, was high enough to show that a self-sustaining reaction was physically possible if the arrangement could be made larger and purer. The men in the basement allowed themselves a moment of real satisfaction. They stood around the instruments and spoke quietly about what the next steps might be. Fermi wrote a careful report for Briggs. Szilard read the report and immediately began drafting new arguments for why the committee should request more resources and move more quickly. Lawrence received a copy and responded with fresh ideas about how his separation work in California could complement the pile experiments in New York. The shadows over the committee had not lifted, but a small light had appeared inside them. The scientists who refused to let the project die in those early, uncertain months showed a kind of dedication that rarely receives medals or public recognition. They kept measuring, kept writing reports, kept traveling between laboratories and committee rooms even when the path forward was blocked by caution and limited resources. That same quiet determination to keep important stories alive, even when the world seems slow to listen, is what makes it possible for us to remember what these men carried and what they risked. If these histories matter to you the way they matter to me, and if you've found value in the time and care that goes into uncovering the human side of these moments, I would be deeply grateful for any support you can offer through Ko-Fi. Even a small tip, as little as $1, helps sustain the research and the long hours it takes to bring these stories forward with the depth they deserve. It's a simple way to say that remembering matters. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The Uranium Committee continued its work through the spring and into the summer, producing reports that grew more detailed and more urgent with each passing month. Fermi's pile experiments improved. Lawrence's ideas about separation gained attention. Szilard's persistent voice kept the sense of urgency alive even when official channels moved slowly. None of them knew exactly how much time they had or whether the Germans were truly ahead. They only knew that the measurements in the basement and the letters traveling between laboratories were the first small steps of a journey whose end no one could yet see. The shadows remained, but the men working inside them had begun to push back against the darkness with the only tools they possessed: patience, precision, and the stubborn refusal to believe that the future was already decided. They left in the night or in the early morning, sometimes with a single suitcase, sometimes with nothing more than the clothes they wore and the equations they carried in their heads, because the countries that had once celebrated their discoveries had decided they no longer belonged. The wave of exile began not with the discovery of fission but with the rise of a regime that viewed science itself as something to be controlled and scientists as people to be sorted by blood and belief. In 1933, When the first decrees swept through German universities, Albert Einstein was already abroad, lecturing in California. He received word that his summer house had been searched, his papers examined, and that his name had been placed on lists of enemies of the new order. He did not return. Instead, he accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a quiet academic village where he could walk the paths and think without being watched. Yet the quiet came at a cost. He had left behind colleagues who had stood with him in the great debates over quantum theory and relativity, men and women whose letters now arrived with increasing gaps between them. Some stopped writing altogether. Einstein carried the knowledge that his fame had protected him, while others, less visible, had been dismissed from their posts and left to find their way in a world that no longer wanted their minds. Leo Szilard had already fled once before. Born in Hungary, he had watched his own country turn toward authoritarianism after the First World War and had moved to Berlin, where the laboratories felt alive with possibility. When the decrees came in Germany, he left again, this time for England and then for America. He carried with him the patent he had filed years earlier for a chain reaction, an idea he had kept secret because he already understood what governments might do with unlimited energy. In America, he moved between temporary positions, never quite settled, always aware that his safety depended on the goodwill of institutions that were still learning to trust foreigners with dangerous knowledge. He wrote long letters to friends still in Europe, letters that sometimes received no answer because the friends had been arrested or had gone into hiding. Szilard learned to measure his own survival by the silence on the other end of the mail route. Enrico Fermi's departure was quieter but no less painful. He had built a world-class laboratory in Rome, gathering around him a group of young physicists who worked with the focused joy of people who believed they were uncovering the secrets of the nucleus together. Then the racial laws arrived in Italy, and because Fermi's wife Laura was Jewish, the family could no longer live without fear. They left in 1938, traveling first to Stockholm where Fermi received the Nobel Prize, then onward to New York with their 2 small children and almost no possessions beyond what fit in their trunks. Fermi accepted a position at Columbia University and immediately set to work on the problem of chain reactions, but the work was shadowed by the knowledge of what he had left behind. Colleagues who had once crowded into his laboratory in Rome were now scattered or silenced. He received occasional letters from those who could still write, letters that spoke of increasing pressure and shrinking possibilities. Fermi read them in the evenings after the laboratory had emptied, then folded them carefully and placed them in a drawer. He did not speak of them often, but the weight of those letters stayed with him while he stacked graphite blocks in the basement and measured the faint signals that might one day change the war. Others followed similar paths, each carrying a different burden. Edward Teller left Hungary after the rise of authoritarianism there, studied in Germany, and then watched the same darkness spread across the country where he had earned his doctorate. He arrived in America with his wife and young child, taking a position first at George Washington University and later moving between institutions as the need for nuclear expertise grew. Teller's mind moved quickly, leaping between ideas with an energy that sometimes exhausted those around him, but beneath the energy was a private grief for the Europe that had shaped him and then rejected him. Eugene Wigner, also Hungarian, had come earlier and had already established himself at Princeton when the larger wave of refugees arrived. He became a quiet anchor for many of the newcomers, helping them find positions, translating their papers, and listening when the weight of exile became too heavy to carry alone. Hans Bethe arrived from Germany after being dismissed from his university post because of his Jewish ancestry. He found work at Cornell and threw himself into the theoretical problems of nuclear physics with a focus that helped him keep the memories of lost colleagues at bay during the daylight hours. At night the memories returned. The stories these men carried were not only about what they had lost, but about what they had been forced to leave unfinished. Laboratories they had built with their own hands were now run by people who measured loyalty by ancestry rather than achievement. Students they had trained were denied degrees or positions. Friends who had shared late-night conversations about the structure of the atom had disappeared into camps or into silence. The letters that still arrived from Europe carried news that grew darker with each passing month. One scientist wrote of being forced to wear a yellow star and of watching his children turned away from school. Another described the burning of books in the square where they had once walked together after seminars. These letters were read in quiet rooms in Princeton and New York and Ithaca, and the men who read them felt the distance between their new safety and the old danger as a physical ache. Yet within the pain there were small moments of kindness that kept them moving forward. American colleagues who had never met a refugee physicist before offered laboratory space, shared equipment, and invited families to dinner so the children could play with others their own age. At Columbia, Herbert Anderson became not only Fermi's collaborator but a friend who understood without being told why Fermi sometimes stared at the graphite pile in silence for long minutes before returning to measurements. In Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study created positions for mathematicians and physicists who had nowhere else to go, and the mathematicians who had already been there welcomed the newcomers as fellow travelers in a world that had grown hostile to free inquiry. Letters of recommendation traveled between universities, written by men who had themselves once been strangers in a new country. These were not grand rescues. They were the ordinary decencies that allowed people who had lost everything to begin again. The renewed purpose these scientists found in America was not only professional but moral. They had watched one regime after another decide that some minds were acceptable and others were not. They had seen the laboratories that had once been centers of open discovery turned into places where questions were filtered through political loyalty. In their new country they encountered a different kind of openness, imperfect and sometimes suspicious of foreigners, but still willing to let them work. That willingness carried an obligation. Many of them began to speak privately about the need to ensure that the power they were uncovering would not fall first into the hands of the regime that had driven them out. Szilard's conversations with Einstein about the letter to Roosevelt grew from this sense of obligation. Fermi's steady work on chain reactions carried the same quiet determination. Teller and Wigner and Bethe brought their theoretical insight to problems that would later shape the design of weapons, not because they loved weapons but because they understood what would happen if the other side succeeded first. There were moments when the weight of that understanding became almost unbearable. Szilard once sat with a colleague in a small New York apartment and spoke of the possibility that the chain reaction he had imagined years earlier might one day destroy cities. He did not raise his voice. He simply described the mathematics and then sat in silence while the city sounds drifted through the open window. Fermi, after a long day in the basement laboratory, sometimes walked the streets of New York with his wife and spoke of Italy in the years before the laws changed, of the cafes where physicists had argued until dawn, and of the students who had once filled his lectures. These were not complaints. They were the necessary acts of remembering that allowed them to keep working without being consumed by grief. The community that formed among the exiles became its own kind of laboratory. In living rooms and borrowed offices they debated not only the technical problems of neutron multiplication and isotope separation but the moral questions that came with them. Some argued that scientists should refuse to work on weapons at all. Others believed that the only moral choice was to ensure the weapon was built first by the side that had not yet turned laboratories into instruments of persecution. These conversations were rarely recorded. They happened over coffee and in the margins of technical papers, and they shaped the way the men approached their work. The knowledge that had once been shared freely across European borders was now being gathered and protected in a new country, carried by people who had every reason to turn away from the task but chose instead to give it everything they had left. The scientists who fled the Reich brought with them more than equations and experimental techniques. They brought the lived experience of what happens when a government decides that some people's minds are dangerous simply because of who they are. That experience became part of the Manhattan Project's foundation, not in any official document but in the private resolve of the men who worked in its laboratories. They had already lost one world. They were determined not to lose another. The deep personal stories of exile, of colleagues left behind and new lives built from almost nothing, of the quiet determination to turn personal loss into a defense against the very forces that had driven them out, are the kind of histories that deserve to be explored without limits. On my Patreon, you'll find free podcasts that go further into these individual journeys, raw and unblurred video sections that show the faces and places behind the names, and a growing community of people who care about remembering the human side of these moments. It's also a place where you can support the work directly through the tip jar if these stories matter to you. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to leave everything and still choose to keep fighting with the only tools you had left, your mind and your courage, the deeper conversations are waiting there. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the United States began to organize its larger effort, the men who had fled Europe had already become its most valuable and most invisible resource. They worked in basements and borrowed offices, wrote reports that were read by cautious committees, and carried the memory of lost laboratories while they built the foundations of new ones. Their presence was Hitler's unintended gift to the country that had taken them in, a gift measured not in equipment or funding but in the irreplaceable experience of minds that had already survived the loss of everything except their determination to understand the world and to protect it from those who would use understanding as a weapon of domination. The project that would eventually take shape at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford would rest on their shoulders as much as on any other foundation, and the stories they carried would remain with them long after the work was done. Families arrived by train or dusty car to places that barely existed on any map they had ever seen, carrying suitcases and children and questions they were not allowed to ask out loud, and were told that for the duration of the war their new address would be a post office box and their purpose would remain a secret even from the people they loved most. The three secret cities rose almost overnight in landscapes that had until recently belonged to farmers, ranchers, and native communities. In the hills of eastern Tennessee, in the desert along the Columbia River in Washington, and on a remote mesa in northern New Mexico, tens of thousands of people were suddenly summoned to build and operate facilities whose true purpose was known to almost no one who worked inside them. They came for different reasons, some because the pay was steady in wartime, some because they had been told their skills were needed for a special project, and some because they had been recruited directly by scientists who could not explain why their particular talents mattered so much. What they shared was the experience of stepping off a train or out of a car into a world that had been created in a matter of months and that operated under rules no ordinary American city had ever known. At Oak Ridge in Tennessee, the transformation was the most visible and the most bewildering. What had been scattered farms and small crossroads became, in less than 2 years, a city of 75,000 people surrounded by fences and guarded gates. The workers who operated the mysterious machines called calatrons lived in dormitories or hastily built houses, and many of them were young women who had never before left their hometowns. They were trained to watch dials and adjust settings according to procedures they were not permitted to question. The machines themselves were enormous, filling entire buildings with the hum of electricity and the smell of warm metal and oil. The women who tended them worked long shifts and returned to dorm rooms where conversation about the work was forbidden even among roommates. Some of them wrote letters home describing the excitement of contributing to the war effort and the strangeness of living in a place where everyone seemed to be hiding something. They could not say what the product of their labor was or why it required such elaborate security. They only knew that their supervisors spoke in quiet voices about the importance of speed and accuracy, and that the occasional security checks reminded them that even a careless word could have consequences they would never be allowed to understand. The families who followed the workers to Oak Ridge experienced a different kind of secrecy. Husbands and wives who had once discussed their jobs over dinner now found themselves living with a permanent silence between them. Children asked why they could not tell their grandparents where they lived or what their parents did all day. The answers were always the same: it is important war work, and the less said the better. Schools were built quickly, churches appeared in converted barracks, and social clubs formed almost as fast as the houses. There were dances on Saturday nights and baseball games on Sunday afternoons, and for a few hours the ordinary rhythms of American life returned. Yet even at those gatherings the conversation stayed carefully away from the one subject that occupied every mind. A woman might ask her neighbor how her husband's shift had gone, and the neighbor would smile and say it had been long but productive, and both women would understand that nothing more could be said. The kindness in those small exchanges, the unspoken recognition that everyone carried the same burden, became one of the quiet bonds that held the community together. Far to the west, along the Columbia River in Washington, the Hanford site rose in an even more desolate landscape. The land had belonged to native tribes for generations before it was taken for the project, and the sudden arrival of thousands of construction workers and later of reactor operators changed the desert in ways that could never be undone. The reactors themselves were built on a scale that seemed impossible for the time, massive concrete structures designed to produce plutonium by bombarding uranium with neutrons inside carefully controlled piles. The workers who built them and later operated them lived in a construction camp that grew into a small city almost as quickly as Oak Ridge. Conditions were harsher than in Tennessee. The wind blew constantly, carrying dust that coated everything, and the summer heat gave way to winters that cut through thin clothing. Many of the men who worked on the reactors had come from farms or small towns and had never imagined working inside something so large and so secret. They were told only that the material they were helping to create would help end the war. Some of them worried quietly about the strange glow they sometimes saw near the reactors or about the health of colleagues who had been on the site longer. Those worries were rarely spoken aloud. The same security that prevented them from describing their work to their families also discouraged questions about the work itself. Families at Hanford faced an isolation that was even more complete than at Oak Ridge. The nearest real town was miles away, and the site itself was surrounded by checkpoints that required special passes. Children grew up knowing that their fathers disappeared each day into a place they could not visit and returned with stories that always stopped short of explanation. Wives organized small gatherings in the evenings, sharing recipes and news from home and the occasional letter that had made it through the censors. Those letters were precious because they represented the only connection to a world where people could speak freely. A woman might read a letter from her mother asking what her husband was doing and then fold it carefully, knowing she could never answer with anything but the same vague reassurance she had been given herself. The resilience required to maintain ordinary family life under those conditions became its own form of quiet heroism. People learned to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries with whatever they could find, to comfort one another when homesickness struck, and to accept that the most important parts of their lives were now permanently divided between what could be said and what could never be spoken. On the high mesa in northern New Mexico, the atmosphere was different but no less strange. Los Alamos had been chosen because it was remote and because the surrounding canyons and mountains made it easy to control access. The scientists who arrived there with their families found a collection of wooden buildings and laboratories that had been thrown up with remarkable speed. Many of them had come from the great universities of Europe and the eastern United States, and the contrast between their previous lives and this windswept hilltop was jarring. Yet within weeks a community had formed. Children played in the streets between the laboratories and the houses. Wives who had once hosted academic dinners now organized potluck suppers and bridge games. The scientists themselves worked long hours in buildings that smelled of solder and chalk and the peculiar ozone scent of electrical equipment, and when they returned home in the evenings they tried, with varying success, to leave the work behind. Some succeeded better than others. A physicist might sit at the dinner table still thinking about the calculations he had left on his desk, while his wife tried to draw him into conversation about their children's school or the latest shortage at the commissary. The tension between the ordinary demands of family life and the extraordinary pressure of the work created a particular kind of strain that only the people living on the hill truly understood. The secrecy at Los Alamos was in some ways more intimate than at the other sites because the people who lived there knew more about the ultimate purpose of the project. They had been chosen precisely because their skills were essential to designing and assembling the weapon itself. Yet even among the scientists there were layers of information that were not shared. A chemist working on explosive lenses might not know the full details of the uranium work happening elsewhere, and a physicist calculating critical mass might be kept from certain aspects of the plutonium production. The compartmentalization was deliberate and tended to limit damage if any single person were compromised. It also created a peculiar loneliness even among people who were surrounded by brilliant colleagues. Conversations at dinner parties or at the Saturday night dances often circled around the edges of what everyone knew but could not fully discuss. A joke about the gadget or a casual reference to when this is over would be met with knowing looks and then a quick change of subject. The shared secret became both a bond and a barrier. Across all three sites, the emotional cost of total secrecy accumulated in small, daily ways. Parents could not explain to their children why they could not visit grandparents or why letters home had to be written so carefully. Married couples who had once shared every detail of their days now lived with permanent and visible walls between them. Friendships formed quickly because everyone understood the same rules, but those friendships also carried the knowledge that they might end abruptly when the war ended and the cities were no longer needed. Some people found the secrecy exhilarating, a sense that they were part of something historic and necessary. Others found it exhausting, a constant low-level fear that a single careless word could bring consequences they could not imagine. Most lived somewhere in between, carrying both pride and uncertainty at the same time. There were moments of genuine kindness that made the isolation bearable. At Oak Ridge, a group of women organized a welcome committee for new arrivals, helping them find housing and explaining the unwritten rules of the secret city. At Hanford, a supervisor quietly arranged for a young worker whose wife was ill back home to receive extra leave, even though the rules made such exceptions difficult. At Los Alamos, the scientists' wives took turns caring for one another's children during long shifts, and the community as a whole created a network of support that allowed families to function despite the pressures. These small acts did not change the fundamental strangeness of living inside a classified world, but they reminded people that they were not entirely alone in carrying the burden. The hidden heroes of these instant cities were not only the scientists whose names would later appear in histories, but the thousands of ordinary workers and families who built the infrastructure, operated the machines, raised the children, and kept the secrets without ever knowing the full scope of what they were protecting. Their contributions made the later successes possible, yet most of them would return to ordinary lives after the war with stories they could never fully tell. The secret cities themselves would eventually be revealed, but the personal cost of living inside them, the divided loyalties, the silenced conversations, the quiet resilience required to maintain normal life under extraordinary conditions, would remain largely invisible to the world outside. The hidden heroes, the forgotten families, and the secret cities that rose in the middle of nowhere to house the largest scientific endeavor in history are exactly the kind of stories that rarely make it into the official record. There is a powerful free ebook called The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II that explores more of these forgotten missions and the people who carried them out in silence, along with weekly deep dives into the human side of the hidden conflicts that decided the war. If these stories of ordinary people living extraordinary lives under total secrecy have stayed with you, the ebook and the newsletter are a wonderful way to keep exploring them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the work inside those cities reached its most critical phase, the people living there had already transformed remote American landscapes into functioning communities bound together by shared purpose and shared silence. They had learned to raise children, celebrate holidays, and comfort one another while carrying the knowledge that the most important part of their lives could never be spoken aloud. That combination of ordinary human resilience and extraordinary secrecy became one of the defining features of the Manhattan Project, and the emotional legacy of those instant cities would stay with the people who built them long after the fences came down and the secrets began, slowly and incompletely, to be revealed. On a windswept mesa in northern New Mexico, a man who had spent his life chasing the invisible architecture of the universe now stood at the edge of a new kind of precipice, carrying the knowledge that the work he was about to lead could either shorten a terrible war or open a door that no one would ever be able to close again. J. Robert Oppenheimer had not expected the summons. He was a theoretical physicist of extraordinary range, a man who could move between quantum mechanics and Sanskrit poetry with equal ease, whose lectures left students both inspired and slightly overwhelmed by the speed of his mind. He had built a reputation at Berkeley as a brilliant but sometimes difficult colleague, a man whose personal life was as complicated as his physics. There had been affairs, political associations that would later be examined under harsh light, and a circle of friends that included people whose views on communism made government officials nervous even before the war began. Yet when General Leslie Groves was looking for someone to direct the new laboratory at Los Alamos, he chose Oppenheimer. The decision surprised many people, including Oppenheimer himself. Groves was a military engineer who valued results above almost everything else. He had seen in Oppenheimer not only scientific brilliance but something rarer, the ability to inspire loyalty and cooperation among men who were used to working alone. The general understood that the scientists who would be gathered on the Hill would not respond well to ordinary military discipline. They needed a leader who could speak their language and still make the impossible seem achievable. Oppenheimer accepted the assignment with a mixture of excitement and dread that he rarely showed in public. He had spent years watching the rise of fascism in Europe and the suffering it caused. Friends and colleagues had fled or been silenced. He had read the letters from Europe and felt the same urgency that had driven Szilard and Einstein to write their warning to Roosevelt. At the same time, he carried a private fear that once the weapon existed it would be used, and that its use would change the moral landscape of the world in ways no one could yet calculate. He had read the Bhagavad Gita and the poetry of John Donne and T.S. Eliot. He understood the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Now he was being asked to deliver knowledge on a scale that might overwhelm wisdom entirely. The early days on the Mesa were steady and controlled chaos. Oppenheimer arrived with a small staff and began the work of turning a collection of wooden buildings and laboratories into a place where the best minds in physics could work together under conditions of absolute secrecy. He recruited personally, writing letters and making phone calls, sometimes traveling to meet scientists who were still reluctant to leave their universities. Many of them came because they trusted him. They had heard him lecture or had read his papers and believed that if anyone could turn the scattered efforts of the Uranium Committee into a working weapon, it was this man who seemed to hold both the technical details and the larger human stakes in his mind at once. Oppenheimer moved among them with a kind of restless energy, appearing in laboratories at odd hours, asking questions that forced people to think more clearly, and occasionally offering a line of poetry or a philosophical observation that reminded them why the work mattered. The scientific challenges were immense and immediate. The gun type designed for a uranium bomb seemed relatively straightforward in principle but required enormous quantities of enriched uranium that were still being produced at Oak Ridge. The plutonium route, which offered the possibility of a more powerful weapon from less material, demanded an entirely different approach called implosion, in which conventional explosives would compress a plutonium core to critical mass in a fraction of a second. The mathematics and engineering of implosion were fiendishly difficult. Small asymmetries in the explosive lenses could ruin the compression and prevent the chain reaction from occurring. Oppenheimer understood that success would require an unprecedented level of collaboration between theoretical physicists who lived in equations and experimentalists who lived in the gritty reality of machining tolerances and chemical reactions. He created groups that crossed those boundaries, insisted that theorists spend time in the shops and that engineers sit in on theory seminars, and made himself available at almost any hour to mediate disagreements or clarify a point that had become tangled in specialized language. The personal cost of that leadership began to show early. Oppenheimer had always been thin, but under the pressure he became thinner still, sustained by black coffee and cigarettes and long nights of work. He wrote letters to his brother Frank, who was also a physicist and who would later join the project, letters in which he tried to describe the strange mixture of exhilaration and dread that came with the work. He spoke of the beauty of the mesa, the way the light changed on the mountains at sunset, and then in the next sentence would turn to the calculations that refused to come out right or the personnel problems that seemed to multiply faster than the neutrons in a chain reaction. His wife Kitty managed the household and raised their 2 young children under conditions that were often difficult. The family lived in a simple house on the hill, and Oppenheimer tried to preserve some ordinary rhythms, reading to the children, walking with Kitty in the evenings, but the work followed him home. There were nights when he sat awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at papers covered in equations and wondering whether the path he had chosen was the right one. The scientists who worked under him saw both the brilliance and the strain. Some of them, like Edward Teller, pushed constantly for bigger and more ambitious designs, including the possibility of a thermonuclear weapon that would dwarf the fission bomb in power. Oppenheimer listened to these ideas with a mixture of fascination and caution. He understood the physics but also the political and moral implications of opening that particular door. Other scientists, like Hans Bethe and Enrico Fermi, brought a steadier focus to the immediate problems. Oppenheimer relied on all of them, balancing their temperaments and their competing visions while keeping the overall direction clear. He had a gift for making each person feel that their contribution was essential, even when he disagreed with them. That gift was not entirely natural. It required constant effort, and the effort took its toll. There were moments of genuine connection that reminded everyone why they had come. On evenings when the work had gone particularly badly, Oppenheimer would sometimes gather a small group on the porch of his house and read poetry aloud, or play a recording of classical music, or simply sit in silence while the stars came out over the mountains. These were not performances. They were acknowledgments that the people working on the hill were not machines and that the pressure they carried needed occasional release. Scientists who had been arguing fiercely in the laboratory earlier in the day would find themselves laughing or speaking quietly about their families or their hopes for after the war. In those moments, the weight of what they were building felt slightly more bearable because it was being carried together. Oppenheimer's own private reflections were darker and more solitary. He understood better than most the destructive potential of what they were creating. He had seen the calculations for the expected yield and had listened to discussions about how the weapon might be delivered. He knew that success would almost certainly mean the deaths of tens or hundreds of thousands of people. At the same time, he believed, or tried to believe, that ending the war quickly might save more lives in the long run by preventing a prolonged invasion of Japan. The tension between those two thoughts never left him. He carried it in the way he walked the paths of Los Alamos late at night, and the cigarettes he smoked one after another, and in the letters he wrote to friends outside the project in which he could say almost nothing about what occupied his days. The burden was not only technical. It was moral, and it grew heavier with each month that passed without a clear path to success. The courage required to carry that burden was not the kind that appears in battlefield stories. It was the quieter courage of continuing to lead when every day brought new evidence of how difficult the task truly was, of protecting the morale of brilliant and sensitive people while knowing that many of them would later look back on this work with complicated feelings, and of holding in his own mind both the immediate necessity of the weapon and the long-term consequences of its existence. Oppenheimer did not pretend the burden was light. He simply refused to set it down. In meetings with General Groves, he argued for resources and defended the scientists against bureaucratic interference. In conversations with his colleagues, he listened to their doubts and their ambitions and tried to steer both toward the common goal. In the privacy of his own thoughts, he measured the distance between the man he had been before the war and the man he was becoming. There were small acts of kindness that revealed the human side of his leadership. He made time to visit the laboratory of a young physicist who was struggling with a difficult calculation, not to solve it for him but to sit with him until the path forward became clearer. He wrote letters of recommendation and encouragement for people whose work had been overlooked. He noticed when someone was carrying too much and quietly arranged for help. These gestures did not change the fundamental nature of the project, but they made it possible for the people on the Hill to keep going when the technical obstacles seemed insurmountable and the moral questions grew louder. The weight Oppenheimer carried was not his alone, but because he stood at the center of the effort, it pressed on him with particular force. He had been chosen because he could see both the physics and the human dimensions of the work, and because he could hold those dimensions together without letting either one overwhelm the other. That ability came at a cost. The man who had once moved so freely between science and poetry now found that the two realms were no longer separate. The equations on his desk and the lines of poetry he sometimes recited in the evenings were connected by the same question: what does it mean to understand something so powerful that it changes the meaning of understanding itself? Just as Oppenheimer carried the personal courage and the impossible burden of leadership in the face of a global war that demanded terrible choices, there are stories from that same conflict that continue to remind us of the human cost and the quiet heroism required of those who bore the heaviest loads. If you want to connect more deeply with the courage of ordinary people and leaders who faced impossible odds during the war, I can't recommend highly enough exploring authentic World War II memorabilia or watching the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which brings to life the personal dramas and sacrifices of the Pacific Campaign in a way that stays with you. These are the kinds of resources that honor the past while helping us understand what was truly at stake. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the first test of the weapon was being planned, Oppenheimer had become both the public face of the laboratory and its private conscience. He had aged visibly in the months on the Hill. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and the restless energy that had once seemed inexhaustible now alternated with periods of quiet exhaustion. Yet he continued to move through the laboratories and the meetings with the same commitment that had brought him there in the first place. The scientists who worked beside him saw a man who was carrying more than any single person should have to carry, and who refused to let that weight become an excuse for lowering his standards or abandoning the people who depended on him. The weapon that would eventually rise from their collective effort would bear his name in the histories that followed, but the true measure of what he had done on that mesa was not only the device itself. It was the community he had held together, the doubts he had carried without letting them paralyze the work, and the private knowledge that success would bring both relief and a new and permanent burden that no one on the Hill could yet fully imagine. They came from farms and mill towns and quiet streets where everyone knew their names, young women who had grown up expecting to marry young and raise children in the same places their mothers had known, and instead found themselves standing in front of machines the size of small buildings, watching dials that controlled a process no one was allowed to explain. Oak Ridge was not a city in any ordinary sense when the first groups of women arrived. It was a construction site that had swallowed whole valleys and hills, a place where mud roads turned to rivers after rain and where new buildings rose faster than anyone could keep track of them. The women who stepped off the buses or trains had been recruited with promises of steady pay and important war work, but almost no one had told them what that work actually was. They were given identification badges, assigned to dormitories or hastily built houses, and instructed never to discuss their jobs outside the gates. Many of them were in their late teens or early 20s. Some had left children with grandparents or husbands who had gone to fight overseas. They carried suitcases that held everything they owned and letters from home that they would not be able to answer with any real detail. The Calatrons filled entire buildings that smelled of warm metal, machine oil, and the faint ozone scent of high-voltage electricity. Each unit was a massive electromagnet that used powerful magnetic fields to separate the rare, fissionable form of uranium from the much more common variety. The women who operated them sat or stood at control panels for 8 or 12-hour shifts, adjusting knobs and watching meters with the kind of focused attention that left little room for conversation. They had been trained to recognize when a reading was drifting and to correct it quickly, but they had never been told why the separation mattered or what the product would eventually become. Supervisors walked the aisles and reminded them that speed and accuracy were matters of national security. The women learned to work through the noise and the heat, through the fatigue that came from staring at instruments hour after hour, and through the strange, persistent feeling that they were doing something both ordinary and enormous at the same time. The secrecy shaped every part of their lives. Letters home had to be written carefully, with whole paragraphs left out or rewritten because the censors would not allow any mention of the machines or the purpose of the work. A young woman might describe the pretty hills around the site or the friends she had made in the dormitory, but she could never say what she did all day or why the guards at the gates checked every package and every conversation. Families back home grew used to the vague answers and the long silences between letters. Some parents worried that their daughters were in danger. Others felt a quiet pride that their girls were contributing to the war in ways they could not explain. The women themselves carried the weight of that silence like an extra layer of clothing. They learned to change the subject when conversations at home threatened to go too deep, and they learned to live with the small, constant ache of not being able to share the most important part of their days. Inside the dormitories, the atmosphere was different. The rooms were small and often crowded, but they became places where the women could speak more freely with one another. They shared stories about the farms or towns they had left, about boyfriends or husbands serving overseas, and about the children some of them had been forced to leave behind. There were nights when someone would bring out a letter from home and read parts of it aloud, and the others would listen with the particular attentiveness of people who understood how precious ordinary news had become. Small kindnesses happened constantly. One woman might cover another's shift when a friend was ill or exhausted. Another might share a care package from home, dividing cookies or canned goods among roommates who had not tasted anything sweet in weeks. These gestures did not change the fundamental strangeness of their situation, but they made the isolation more bearable. In a place where almost everything was classified, the simple act of offering comfort or sharing a meal became a form of quiet resistance against the loneliness the secrecy created. The work itself carried risks that were only partly understood at the time. The Calatrons used strong magnetic fields and high voltages, and the buildings sometimes grew uncomfortably hot from the equipment. Some of the women noticed that they felt unusually tired after long shifts or that small cuts took longer to heal than they should. A few worried privately about what the machines might be doing to their bodies, but they rarely spoke of those worries out loud. The culture of secrecy discouraged questions, and the supervisors offered reassurance that the work was safe as long as procedures were followed. Most of the women accepted the reassurance because they wanted to believe it and because there was no one they could ask for a second opinion. They continued to show up for their shifts, to watch the dials with steady concentration, and to return to their dorms or houses carrying the same mixture of pride and uncertainty that had accompanied them since the day they arrived. Pride was real and widespread. These women knew they were part of something larger than themselves even if they could not name it. They had been told, in general terms, that their accuracy and speed could help bring the war to an end. That knowledge gave meaning to the long hours and the separation from home. When a supervisor praised a particularly steady performance or when a group finished a difficult run without error, there was a quiet satisfaction that spread through the building. Some of the women began to take a personal interest in the machines they operated, learning the quirks of individual units and developing a feel for when something was about to drift out of tolerance. That expertise was never officially recognized, but it mattered to the women themselves. It turned repetitive work into something that required skill and judgment, and it gave them a sense of ownership over a small piece of the enormous effort. The emotional toll accumulated in ways that were harder to measure. Mothers who had left children behind wrote letters that tried to sound cheerful while hiding how much they missed small voices and familiar routines. Young women who had expected to marry and settle near their families now faced the possibility that the war would change everything before they had a chance to return. Relationships formed quickly in the dorms and sometimes just as quickly ended when someone was transferred to another shift or another building. The secrecy made ordinary friendship more complicated because there were always things that could not be said. Yet the same secrecy also created a bond that was difficult to explain to outsiders. The women who worked the Calatrons understood one another in ways that people who had never lived inside a classified world could not fully grasp. They shared a language of half-finished sentences and meaningful glances that said more than words were allowed to. There were moments when the larger purpose of the work brushed against their daily lives in unexpected ways. Occasionally, a supervisor or a visiting scientist would speak in careful, indirect language about the importance of what they were producing. The women would listen and nod and return to their panels with a renewed sense of purpose, even though they still did not know exactly what the separated material would be used for. Some of them imagined it was for a new kind of explosive or a powerful new fuel. Others simply accepted that their part in the story was to keep the dial steady and the product pure. That acceptance was itself a form of resilience. They had been asked to trust that their small, precise actions mattered on a scale they could not see, and most of them chose to believe that trust was justified. The hidden human cost of Oak Ridge was carried most heavily by these women whose names would never appear in official histories. They worked the machines that made the enriched uranium possible, endured the secrecy that isolated them from their families, and lived with health uncertainties that would only become clearer decades later. Their contributions were essential, yet they remained invisible to the world outside the gates. The pride they felt in their work and the quiet strength they showed in maintaining normal life under abnormal conditions were never fully acknowledged while the project was still secret. Only much later would some of them begin to speak about what those years had cost and what they had helped to create. The harsh, uncensored realities of what these women endured, the radiation exposure whose long-term effects were poorly understood, the crushing weight of total secrecy that divided families and silenced conversations, and the hidden human cost borne by ordinary workers whose labor made the entire effort possible, are preserved in collections of raw photographs and film that were never meant for public view. If you want to see the unfiltered faces and conditions behind the official story of Oak Ridge and similar sites, there is a powerful digital collection of unseen war imagery and footage available that shows the true scale of what was asked of people whose names history largely forgot. It is the kind of record that helps us understand the personal price paid by those who kept the machines running and the secrets intact. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the enriched uranium from Oak Ridge began to move toward its final destination, the women who had operated the Calatrons had already become part of a story much larger than any of them had imagined when they first stepped off the bus. They had learned to live with constant vigilance and constant silence. They had formed friendships that would last a lifetime and carried worries that would stay with them for decades. They had done work that required precision and patience under conditions that offered neither recognition nor full understanding. Their invisible labor made the later stages of the project possible, and the emotional and physical price they paid remained largely unseen even after the gates of Oak Ridge finally opened and the secret city began, slowly and incompletely, to reveal what had been built inside it. In the wind-scoured desert along the Columbia River, where sagebrush and basalt had held the land for centuries, men and women began to raise structures so large they looked like they had been dropped from another world, and they did it while carrying the knowledge that the harvest they were bringing in was invisible, dangerous, and meant for a purpose they were not allowed to fully understand. The land had belonged to native communities for generations before the fences went up and the construction crews arrived. Families who had fished the river and hunted the hills were told they had to leave, sometimes with little notice and with compensation that felt more like an afterthought than justice. The sudden arrival of thousands of workers turned quiet river bends into roaring construction sites almost overnight. Barracks rose and rose, roads were carved through the dust, and the air filled with the sound of hammers, engines, and shouted orders. The people who came to build the reactors came for many reasons. Some were skilled tradesmen looking for steady wartime pay. Others were young men who had been turned away from military service for one reason or another and wanted to contribute in any way they could. A few were simply looking for work in a country where jobs were still hard to find in many places. None of them were told the full truth about what they were building. The reactors themselves were unlike anything most of the workers had ever seen. Massive graphite blocks stacked inside thick concrete shields, pierced by channels where uranium fuel would be inserted and where cooling water would flow. The design was simple in concept and terrifying in scale. Neutrons from the uranium would strike other uranium atoms, releasing more neutrons and heat, and in the process some of the uranium would be transformed into a new element that did not exist naturally on Earth in any useful quantity. That new element was plutonium, and once it was created inside the reactor it had to be chemically separated from the spent fuel in a process that was itself dangerous and highly secret. The workers who built the first reactor, known later as B reactor, worked in shifts that stretched through the desert heat and the bitter cold that followed. They poured concrete in conditions that blistered hands and baked skin. They climbed scaffolding that swayed in the constant wind. They ate meals in crowded mess halls where conversation about the job was limited to the safest topics. Most of them understood only that they were helping to produce something powerful that would help win the war. The details were kept from them on purpose. Living conditions in the early months were rough even by wartime standards. Many workers slept in barracks that smelled of fresh lumber and sweat. Families who had followed the men to the site lived in small houses or trailers that offered little protection from the dust that blew in from the surrounding desert. The Columbia River, once a source of salmon and clean water for the people who had lived along its banks, now carried the runoff from construction and later the cooling water from the reactors themselves. Some workers noticed that the river changed color or that fish seemed less plentiful than they had been. They mentioned it to one another in quiet conversations after shifts, but they rarely raised the subject with supervisors. The culture of the site discouraged questions that might slow the work. Security was constant and visible. Guards checked identification at every gate. Mail was read before it left the area. Even conversations between coworkers were expected to stay away from anything that might reveal the true purpose of the massive concrete buildings rising along the river. The health risks were present from the beginning, though they were not always named. The uranium fuel that went into the reactors was radioactive, and the plutonium that came out was far more so. Workers who handled the fuel or later the separated plutonium wore protective clothing and followed procedures that were meant to limit exposure. But the long-term effects of low-level radiation were still poorly understood. Some men noticed that they tired more easily than before or that small wounds took longer to heal. Others developed coughs that would not go away. They were told these were the ordinary complaints of hard physical labor in a difficult climate. Most accepted the explanation because they wanted to believe it and because there was little they could do if it was not true. The moral weight of what they were helping to create sat differently with different people. Some felt a fierce pride that they were part of the effort to defeat an enemy they had come to hate through newsreels and letters from friends overseas. Others carried a quieter unease, especially those who had grown up near the river or who had native friends and neighbors who had been forced to leave. They did not speak of that unease often, but it showed in the way they sometimes stood at the edge of the site at the end of a shift, looking out over the water and the hills that no longer belonged to the people who had known them best. There were moments of genuine human connection that made the isolation and the danger more bearable. In the barracks and the mess halls, men shared stories from home and passed around letters from wives and children. When someone received bad news from overseas, others would quietly take on extra work or bring an extra cup of coffee without being asked. Families who lived in the small communities that grew up around the site organized potluck dinners and church services in whatever buildings were available. Children played in the dust between houses, unaware that the structures their fathers were building would one day be studied by historians trying to understand how ordinary people had been asked to participate in something so far beyond ordinary understanding. These small acts of kindness did not change the fundamental nature of the work, but they reminded the workers that they were still human beings living ordinary lives inside an extraordinary situation. The separation process that followed the reactors added another layer of risk and secrecy. Once the irradiated uranium was removed from the reactor, it had to be dissolved in acid and run through a series of chemical steps to isolate the plutonium. The buildings where this happened were heavily shielded, and the workers inside them followed strict procedures to avoid contact with the highly radioactive solutions. Even so, there were accidents and near misses that were recorded in internal reports but rarely discussed with the men and women who had been involved. The culture of the site treated such incidents as problems to be solved by better procedures rather than as reasons to question the work itself. Most workers accepted this framing because the alternative was to confront the possibility that the harvest they were bringing in might be more dangerous than anyone had admitted. The emotional consequences of Hanford accumulated slowly and unevenly. Some workers left after a few months, unable to tolerate the secrecy or the physical demands. Others stayed for the duration of the war and beyond, building lives in the new communities that had grown up around the site. Those who remained carried a complicated mixture of pride and doubt. They had helped produce the material that would eventually be used in one of the bombs dropped on Japan. They had done so under conditions that asked them to accept risks they did not fully understand and to keep secrets that divided them from their own families. Some would later speak of those years with a sense of accomplishment. Others would describe a lingering unease that never entirely left them. The land itself bore the marks of what had been done. The river carried traces of the cooling water and the chemical processes for decades afterward. The hills that had once supported native communities were now home to facilities whose purpose had shifted from wartime urgency to Cold War production and eventual cleanup. The dedication required to uncover and tell these stories without flinching, to sit with the full human and environmental cost of what was built along that river, is the same kind of dedication that keeps important history alive when the official record prefers to move on. If these accounts of ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens have meant something to you, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told with care and depth, I would be truly grateful for any support you can offer through Ko-Fi. Even a small tip, as little as $1, helps sustain the research and the time it takes to bring these hidden chapters forward. It is a simple way to say that remembering the full cost matters. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the plutonium from Hanford began its journey toward the assembly buildings at Los Alamos, the desert along the Columbia had been permanently altered. The reactors continued to run, producing more of the element that had never existed in nature until human hands coaxed it into being. The workers who had built and operated those reactors returned to ordinary lives carrying memories that most of them could never fully share. Some would watch their children grow up in the shadow of the same facilities where they had worked. Others would move away and try to leave the dust and the secrecy behind. The land itself would remember longer than any of them. The river would carry the consequences downstream for generations. And the people who had once fished and hunted along those banks would carry the story of displacement and loss as part of their own continuing history. Hanford had delivered what it was asked to deliver. The harvest had been gathered. What remained was the question of whether anyone had truly understood the price that would be paid, not only in the cities where the bombs would fall, but in the quiet desert where the invisible element had first been coaxed from the heart of uranium. In the laboratories on the hill, men and women stared at the shattered fragments of another test assembly scattered across the desert floor and felt the war clock ticking louder with every failed detonation, wondering how many more nights of calculation and redesign they could endure before time itself ran out on them. The plutonium bomb could not use the same straightforward approach that seemed to be working for uranium. The material arrived with a stubborn flaw that refused to be ignored. Plutonium was far more likely to fission on its own, sending out stray neutrons that could start the chain reaction too early, before the two pieces had fully come together. A gun-type assembly that worked in theory for uranium would simply fizzle with plutonium, wasting the precious material and the months of effort that had gone into producing it. The only path forward was implosion, a method that required crushing a solid sphere of plutonium inward from all directions at once, squeezing it to critical density in a fraction of a second. The idea was elegant on paper. In practice, it demanded an almost impossible coordination of chemistry, physics, and engineering under conditions where even a tiny asymmetry could ruin everything. Teams of physicists and chemists worked in buildings that smelled of machine oil, solder, and the sharp chemical tang of high explosives. They divided the problem into pieces that could be attacked from different directions at once. Some spent their days calculating the exact shape an explosive charge would need to produce a perfectly spherical shock wave. Others built and tested small-scale versions in the desert, setting off charges and photographing the results with high-speed cameras that captured only a few millionths of a second at a time. Still others worked on the diagnostics, trying to find ways to measure what was happening inside the metal while the explosion was still in progress. The collaboration was intense and often exhausting. A theorist might walk into an experimental shop with a new set of equations only to be told that the numbers could not be machined with the tools available. An engineer might return from a test firing with data that forced the theorists to start their calculations over from the beginning. These exchanges happened in corridors, over coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, and in meetings that stretched long into the night. The pressure came from every direction. General Groves visited the Hill regularly and made it clear that the entire project was racing against an enemy who might already be further along. Oppenheimer moved among the groups with quiet intensity, listening more than he spoke, asking the questions that forced people to confront the gaps in their thinking. He understood that the scientists and engineers were not machines. They needed moments of rest and recognition even when the calendar gave them almost none. Late one evening, after a particularly discouraging series of test failures, he gathered a small group on the porch outside one of the laboratories and simply sat with them while the desert cooled. No one spoke of the work for nearly an hour. They talked instead about the mountains visible in the distance and the families they had left behind. When they returned to their desks the next morning, the despair that had hung over the group seemed slightly lighter, not because the problem had been solved, but because they had remembered they were not carrying it alone. The technical difficulties were relentless. The explosive lenses had to be machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and even then the shock waves they produced refused to behave symmetrically. A lens that worked perfectly in one test would produce a lopsided compression in the next. The team tried different explosive formulations, different shapes, different ways of initiating the detonation. Each change required new calculations and new test firings. The desert floor became littered with the remains of assemblies that had come close but not close enough. Some of the younger scientists began to doubt whether the method could ever be made reliable in time. They worked longer hours, slept less, and carried the fear that their failure might mean the plutonium bomb would never be ready. The older hands among them had seen enough scientific problems to know that breakthroughs often arrived just when patience was running out, but even they felt the strain. There were small moments of triumph that kept the effort alive. One afternoon, a chemist who had been experimenting with different ways of casting the explosive lenses noticed that a slight change in the cooling rate produced a more uniform material. He brought the new lenses to the test site and watched as the high-speed photographs showed a shock wave that was measurably closer to spherical than anything they had achieved before. The group that had been working on that particular problem stood together in the control bunker afterward, passing around the developed film and pointing out the improvement with the quiet satisfaction of people who had just moved a mountain by inches. They did not celebrate loudly. There was still too much work ahead. But in the days that followed, the new casting technique spread through the other teams, and the mood in the laboratory shifted from grim endurance to something closer to cautious hope. The human bonds that formed under that pressure were as important as any equation. Physicists who had once competed with one another for recognition now shared credit freely because the problem was too large for any single person to claim. Engineers who had arrived at Los Alamos expecting to work on conventional weapons found themselves learning the language of nuclear physics so they could speak more effectively with the theorists. Friendships formed across those boundaries. A young physicist might find himself eating dinner with a machinist who had once worked in an automobile factory, both of them trying to explain their day's frustrations in terms the other could understand. These conversations happened in the mess hall, on the paths between buildings, and in the small houses where families tried to maintain some semblance of ordinary life. The wives and children on the hill became part of the effort in ways that were rarely acknowledged. They kept the households running when their husbands worked through the night. They listened to the carefully edited versions of the day's problems and offered the kind of steady presence that made the impossible seem slightly more manageable. The private fears were rarely spoken in full. Most of the people working on implosion understood that success would mean the creation of a weapon capable of destroying an entire city. They carried that knowledge while they adjusted dials and recalculated shockwave velocities. Some of them wrote letters to colleagues who had chosen not to join the project, letters in which they tried to explain why they had accepted the work and what it was costing them. Others kept their doubts to themselves, channeling the unease into longer hours at the laboratory. Oppenheimer himself moved through these months with a growing sense of the responsibility he carried. He had recruited many of the people now working on the Hill. He had assured them that the work was necessary. Now he watched them struggle with the technical details and with the moral weight, and he understood that his own burden was to keep them moving forward without letting the larger questions paralyze the effort. Breakthroughs arrived in fragments rather than in a single dramatic moment. A better understanding of how to initiate the detonation at multiple points simultaneously reduced the asymmetry in the shock wave. A new diagnostic technique using X-ray flashes allowed the team to see inside the compressing metal for the first time. Each small advance was celebrated with the particular restraint of people who knew how much farther they still had to go. The mood in the laboratories became one of guarded optimism. The war was still raging in the Pacific, and every week that passed without a working design felt like a week the enemy might be using to their own advantage. Yet the teams on the Hill had begun to believe that the code could be cracked, that the mathematics and the chemistry and the engineering could be made to align in time. The intense collaborative struggles, the late-night breakthroughs that came only after weeks of apparent failure, and the human bonds that formed between people who had every reason to work in isolation but chose instead to share the load, are exactly the kinds of stories that deserve to be explored without limits or filters. On my Patreon, you'll find free podcasts that go deeper into these moments of collective problem-solving under impossible pressure, raw and unblurred video sections that show the faces and the laboratories behind the names, and a growing community of people who care about remembering how ordinary human beings accomplished extraordinary things when the stakes could not have been higher. It's also a place where you can support the work directly through the tip jar if these stories matter to you. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to stand at the edge of a scientific frontier while the world waited for an answer that might change everything, the deeper conversations are waiting there. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the design had been refined enough to move from small-scale tests to full-scale assemblies, the people who had lived inside the problem for so many months carried both relief and a new kind of weight. They had solved the immediate technical riddle of how to make implosion work reliably. They had done so through a combination of stubborn persistence, shared expertise, and the quiet courage required to keep believing in a solution when every test seemed to prove that no solution existed. The plutonium bomb was no longer an impossible dream. It was now a device that could be built, tested, and, if the orders came, delivered. The men and women who had cracked the code would carry the memory of those months for the rest of their lives, not only because of what they had accomplished, but because of what that accomplishment would eventually mean for the world they had hoped to protect. The war clock had not stopped, but for the first time in many long months the teams on the Hill could look at one another across a laboratory bench and believe that they might still be in time. In the pre-dawn darkness of the New Mexico desert, a group of men who had spent years turning equations into metal now stood scattered across the sand, each carrying the knowledge that the next few minutes would either prove they had succeeded beyond imagination or reveal that everything they had sacrificed had been for nothing. The test had been delayed twice already by weather that refused to cooperate. Thunderstorms rolled across the desert floor, and the wind shifted in ways that made the safety calculations uncertain. Oppenheimer had walked the perimeter of the site again and again through the night, stopping to speak with the men who would trigger the device and with the scientists who had come to observe what they had helped create. He looked thinner than he had even a month earlier, the lines around his eyes deeper from nights without sleep. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but those closest to him could hear the exhaustion beneath it. He had carried the responsibility for so long that it had become part of the way he stood and the way he moved through a room. Now the moment that would either justify or condemn that responsibility was finally at hand. Fermi had driven out from Los Alamos with a small group of colleagues. He had brought along a handful of paper scraps and a pencil, intending to estimate the yield by dropping the scraps from shoulder height at the moment of the flash and measuring how far the blast wave carried them. It was a characteristically practical gesture from a man who had spent his life turning impossible questions into measurable ones. As they waited, he moved among the observers, offering quiet reassurance to those who looked most uneasy. He understood better than most what the physics predicted, but he also understood that predictions and reality could part company in ways no calculation could capture. When someone asked him whether he thought the device would work, he answered simply that they would know in a few minutes and that worrying about it now would change nothing. The tower stood alone in the middle of the desert, a steel structure that had been erected with the same care and precision that had gone into every other part of the project. At its top sat the gadget, the assembled implosion device that contained the plutonium core and the carefully shaped explosive lenses designed to crush it into criticality. Around the base of the tower, instruments had been placed to measure every aspect of the coming explosion: the light, the heat, the shock wave, the radioactive debris that would be carried into the atmosphere. The men who had installed those instruments had done so knowing they would not be able to retrieve them afterward. Their work was finished. Now all that remained was to wait. The tension in the control bunker was almost physical. Scientists who had argued fiercely over design details for months now stood or sat in near silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Some had brought cameras, though they had been warned that the light would be too intense for ordinary film. Others simply stared at the tower through the thick glass of the bunker windows, trying to imagine what was about to happen inside the metal sphere they could no longer see. A few had written letters the night before, letters they had left with colleagues in case the test went wrong in ways no one had anticipated. The possibility of catastrophic failure had never been entirely dismissed. If the compression was uneven, the plutonium might simply melt or scatter without producing a full chain reaction. If the calculations were wrong in the other direction, the yield might exceed every estimate. Either outcome carried consequences that were difficult to contemplate in the quiet before dawn. Oppenheimer had chosen his observation point carefully. He wanted to be close enough to feel the event but far enough to survive it. As the final minutes ticked away, he stood with his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the tower. He had quoted the Bhagavad Gita to himself more than once in the preceding weeks, the line about becoming death, the destroyer of worlds. The words had come to him not as a dramatic declaration but as a private recognition of what the work had required of him and what it might now require of the world. He did not speak the line aloud that morning. He simply carried it as he had carried so many other burdens, as a reminder that knowledge once gained could not be unlearned and that power once created could not be wished away. When the countdown reached 0, there was a moment of perfect stillness across the desert. Then the sky itself seemed to split open. A light brighter than any sunrise flooded the landscape, turning night into day and casting shadows that stretched for miles. The heat reached the observers even at their distance, a wave of warmth that felt wrong in the cool desert air. The sound arrived later, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. The mushroom cloud rose slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. A column of fire and dust and superheated air that climbed thousands of feet into the sky before spreading into the familiar shape that would soon become known around the world. In the control bunker, the silence broke into a chaos of voices. Some men shouted in triumph. Others stood frozen, unable to speak. One physicist who had worked on the explosive lenses for months simply sat down on the floor and put his head in his hands. The mixture of exhilaration and horror was visible on every face. They had succeeded. The implosion design had worked. The chain reaction had sustained itself long enough to release energy on a scale no one in that room had ever witnessed. Yet the success brought with it an immediate and sobering realization. The device they had built was no longer a theoretical possibility or a laboratory curiosity. It was a weapon that could now be carried across an ocean and dropped on a city. Oppenheimer turned away from the tower and walked a short distance from the others. He stood alone for a moment, watching the cloud continue to rise and spread. Later he would say that the line from the Bhagavad Gita had come back to him in that instant, but those who were near him that morning remembered something quieter. He looked not triumphant but deeply weary, as though the weight he had carried for so long had not lifted but simply changed form. The work was not finished. There would be more devices to assemble, more tests to plan, more decisions to make about how and when the weapon would be used. Yet something fundamental had shifted in those first seconds after the flash. The world had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. And every person who had watched the sky light up understood that they would never again be able to think about war or peace or the future of humanity in quite the same way. Fermi's paper scraps fluttered in the blast wave exactly as he had predicted they would. He made his quick calculation and announced a yield that was close to the estimates the team had carried in their heads for months. The number itself mattered less than the fact that the device had performed. Around him, colleagues shook hands or embraced or simply stood in silence, each processing the moment in his own way. Some felt an overwhelming pride that their persistence had been rewarded. Others felt the first stirrings of a guilt that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A few spoke quietly about what the test meant for the war that was still being fought across the Pacific. If this weapon could be delivered against Japan, the conflict might end without the need for a costly invasion. That possibility carried its own moral weight, one that would be debated in the weeks and months ahead. The team returned to Los Alamos in a state of exhausted elation mixed with something closer to grief. The success they had worked toward for so long had arrived, and with it had come the knowledge that their creation would now move out of their hands and into the hands of military and political leaders who would decide its use. Oppenheimer met with Groves and the other senior figures to discuss the results and the next steps. He listened to the plans for additional devices and for the deployment that was already being prepared. He offered technical advice when it was asked for and kept his deeper reservations to himself for the moment. There would be time later for those conversations. For now, the immediate task was to ensure that what had been proven in the desert could be replicated in the weapons that would actually be carried to their targets. In the days that followed the test, letters began to circulate among the scientists who had been present. Some wrote to colleagues who had not been cleared to attend, describing the event in careful language that conveyed both the technical success and the emotional impact without revealing classified details. Others wrote to family members, trying to explain why they had been away and what the work had meant to them. The letters were full of the same mixture of pride and unease that had marked the test itself. One physicist wrote to his wife that he had never felt so small and so powerful at the same time. Another described the light as something that had burned away not only the darkness of the desert but also any remaining illusion that science could remain separate from the moral choices of the world that used it. The hidden human drama behind that single morning in the desert, the years of doubt and collaboration, the private fears carried in silence, and the irreversible threshold that was crossed in a few blinding seconds, is exactly the kind of story that rarely appears in the official record. There is a powerful free ebook called The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II that explores more of these hidden missions and the people who lived through them. along with weekly deep dives into the human side of the conflicts that decided the war. If the story of the Trinity test and the men and women who carried its weight has stayed with you, the ebook and the newsletter are a wonderful way to keep exploring the deeper layers of what was asked of ordinary people in extraordinary times. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the weeks after Trinity, the desert returned to its usual quiet, but the people who had stood in that quiet before the flash would never be the same. They had seen with their own eyes what their years of work had produced. They had felt the heat and heard the thunder and watched the cloud climb into the sky. Some would go on to advocate for international control of atomic energy. Others would return to their laboratories and try to push the boundaries of physics even further. All of them would carry the memory of that morning as both a triumph of human ingenuity and a warning about the power that ingenuity had placed in human hands. The fire that lit the sky at Trinity had burned away more than the darkness of the desert. It had burned away the last comfortable illusion that knowledge could be pursued without regard for the uses to which it would be put. The scientists who had made that fire possible now faced the harder task of living in the world they had helped to create. In a quiet room in Washington, men spread maps across a long table and began the terrible arithmetic of deciding which Japanese cities would vanish from the earth, each name representing not just factories and ports but homes, families, and lives that would never be the same. The success at Trinity had changed everything and nothing at once. The weapon existed. It worked. Now the question was no longer whether it could be built but how and when and against whom it would be used. A target committee was formed, bringing together military officers who thought in terms of strategic effect and scientists who carried the memory of what they had seen in the desert. Oppenheimer was among those asked to advise. He had flown back from Los Alamos still carrying the dust of the test site on his shoes and the image of the rising cloud in his mind. When he sat down at the table, he spoke with the careful precision that had become his habit under pressure, laying out the technical realities of the two bombs that would soon be ready. One was the uranium device that had not required a full-scale test. The other was the plutonium implosion weapon whose performance had just been proven in the desert. Both were limited in number. Both would be delivered by the specially modified B-29s of the 509th Composite Group already training in the Pacific. The discussions quickly moved beyond technical details into questions that no chart or calculation could answer. Which cities should be chosen? Should the target be purely military, or should the psychological impact on the Japanese leadership and population be the primary consideration? The military men spoke of ports, industrial centers, and transportation hubs that supported the Japanese war effort. The scientists listened and offered what they knew about the expected power of the weapons and the likely radius of destruction. Yet beneath the professional language ran a deeper current of unease. Some at the table had already begun to wonder whether demonstrating the bomb's power on a city full of people was the only or even the best way to force an end to the war. Others believed that only the shock of actual use would convince the Japanese leadership to surrender without the need for an invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Oppenheimer carried his own private burden into those meetings. He had seen the fireball rise over the desert. He had heard the thunder that followed. He understood better than most what the device would do to a city of wooden houses and crowded streets. In the weeks after Trinity, he had received letters from colleagues who had not been at the test, letters asking whether there might still be time to find another path. He answered them carefully, weighing each word. He believed the bomb could end the war. He also feared what its first use would mean for the future relationship between nations and for the moral standing of the country that used it. In the target committee, he argued for cities that had clear military significance, places where the destruction would be seen as a legitimate act of war rather than an attack on civilians for its own sake. He knew the distinction was fragile. Any city large enough to matter would contain factories and ports and also schools and hospitals and homes. Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, brought a different perspective to the table. He had served in government for decades and carried a deep sense of historical responsibility. When the list of potential targets came before him, he looked at the names and crossed one off without hesitation. Kyoto, the ancient capital and cultural heart of Japan, was removed from consideration. Stimson had visited the city years earlier and understood its significance beyond any military calculation. He argued that destroying it would create a lasting bitterness that could poison relations for generations. The decision was his alone in that moment, and those who heard him speak of it later remembered the quiet conviction in his voice. It was one of the few instances in which a personal memory of a place shaped a decision that would otherwise have been made on purely strategic grounds. Other cities remained on the list. Hiroshima stood out because of its military headquarters and its role as a major port and industrial center. It had not been heavily bombed in the conventional raids that had already devastated much of Japan's urban landscape, which meant the full effect of the new weapon could be measured clearly. Kokura was another strong candidate, home to a large arsenal. Nagasaki appeared lower on the list at first, though its shipyards and industrial districts gave it strategic value. Niigata was also considered, though its distance from the primary bases in the Marianas made it less practical for the initial missions. The committee weighed these factors in long sessions that stretched through afternoons and into evenings. Maps were marked and remarked. Weather patterns were studied because the bombing run required clear skies for the visual aiming that had been chosen over radar. The men at the table knew that once the order was given, the choice of city would be final for that mission. There would be no second chances if the weather closed in or if mechanical problems forced the plane to turn back. The ethical arguments surfaced in different forms. Some of the scientists present had already signed or supported the Frank Report earlier in the summer, a document that urged the United States to demonstrate the bomb's power on an uninhabited target before using it against the city. The report had not carried the day. The prevailing view among those who held decision-making authority was that only the actual destruction of a living city would convey the necessary shock to the Japanese leadership and shorten the war. Oppenheimer himself had come to accept this reasoning, though not without cost. In private conversations he spoke of the terrible responsibility that now rested on a handful of men in Washington and in the Pacific. He understood the argument that using the bomb would save lives by making an invasion unnecessary. He also understood the counterargument that once the weapon had been used, the world would forever live under the shadow of its possible use again. The personal toll of these discussions showed in small ways. Stimson, normally composed and deliberate, sometimes rubbed his eyes during long meetings as if trying to clear a vision he could not escape. Oppenheimer chain-smoked more heavily than usual and spoke less in the later sessions, listening more than he argued. Military officers who had planned conventional bombing campaigns for years found themselves facing a different kind of calculation. The bomb did not distinguish between military and civilian targets in the way a precision raid might. Its power was so great that the distinction itself began to blur. One officer remarked quietly after a session that he had never before been asked to choose a city for destruction with the certainty that most of its inhabitants would not survive. The remark was not meant as criticism. It was simply an acknowledgement of the scale on which they were now operating. Letters and memos circulated among the scientists who had access to the discussions. Some wrote to colleagues still at Los Alamos, describing the target meetings in careful language that conveyed the weight of the decisions without revealing operational details. Others kept private journals in which they tried to sort through their own feelings about what was being planned. A few expressed the hope that the mere existence of the bomb, once demonstrated, would be enough to force surrender without further use. Most understood that the momentum of the project and the demands of the war made that outcome unlikely. The device had been built to be used. The men who had built it were now being asked to help decide where and how that use would occur. The agonizing nature of the choices was clearest in the moments when the conversation turned from strategy to consequence. Someone would mention the expected number of casualties in a city of a certain size, and the room would fall briefly silent before another voice redirected the discussion back to military objectives. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken recognition that behind every number were families waking to an ordinary morning, children walking to school, workers reporting to factories that would soon cease to exist. The men at the table had been asked to carry the burden of that knowledge and still make the decision they believed would bring the war to the quickest possible end. Some of them would later say that the weight never entirely left them. Others would defend the choice as the only responsible one available at the time. All of them understood that history would judge the decision long after the immediate urgency of the war had passed. Just as these men sat with the agonizing decisions of war and the impossible burdens of choosing between terrible alternatives in the Pacific theater, there are powerful stories from that same conflict that continue to remind us of the human cost and the quiet courage required of those who bore the heaviest loads. If you want to connect more deeply with the courage of ordinary people and leaders who faced impossible odds during the war, I can't recommend highly enough exploring authentic World War II memorabilia or watching the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which brings to life the personal dramas and sacrifices of the Pacific Campaign in a way that stays with you. These are the kinds of resources that honor the past while helping us understand what was truly at stake. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the end, the target list was narrowed and approved. Hiroshima stood at the top, followed by Kokura and Nagasaki. The orders were prepared and the crews trained. The scientists who had advised on the targets returned to their laboratories or to their homes carrying the knowledge that their work had now moved beyond the realm of theory and into the realm of direct consequence. Oppenheimer flew back to Los Alamos for a final period of preparation before the missions would be flown. He spoke little about the target discussions even with those closest to him. The decision had been made by others with the authority to make it. His role had been to provide the best technical understanding available and to live with whatever followed. The cities had been chosen. The bombs were nearly ready. The only remaining question was whether the Japanese leadership would surrender before the first mission took off from the island of Tinian. If they did not, the fire that had lit the sky over the desert would soon rise over one of the names that had been written on the maps in that quiet room in Washington. High above the Pacific, in a silver B-29 named for his mother, a pilot and his crew carried a single bomb that weighed more than any weapon ever dropped from an airplane, and they flew toward a city whose name they had only just learned on the morning of the mission itself. The 509th Composite Group had trained in near-total secrecy at a remote base in the Utah desert. The men who arrived there had been handpicked for skill and discretion. They practiced long flights over empty landscapes, releasing dummy bombs that looked nothing like ordinary ordnance. The casings were oddly shaped, heavier at one end, and the bombardiers learned to aim them with a precision that went beyond anything required in conventional bombing. The pilots and crews were told only that they were preparing for a special mission that could shorten the war. Most of them accepted the secrecy as part of the job. They had grown used to living in a world where questions were answered with the same quiet phrase, "It is important, and you cannot speak of it." Paul Tibbets had been chosen to lead the group because he combined the steady hand of an experienced bomber pilot with the ability to keep his own counsel. He had flown combat missions in Europe and North Africa, and he understood what it meant to carry responsibility for other men's lives. When he was told the nature of the weapon his planes would carry, he did not hesitate. He simply asked how much time he would have to prepare his crews and what resources he would be given. The answer was everything he needed, and almost no explanation beyond the fact that the bomb would be unlike anything that had ever been used. Tibbets chose his crews carefully. He wanted men who could fly long distances without complaint, who could handle the unexpected without panic, and who would not ask questions that could not be answered. Robert Lewis became his co-pilot. Thomas Farabee would release the bomb. Morris Jepson, a young weaponeer, would ride in the bomb bay on the final mission to monitor the device itself. These men and the others who made up the Enola Gay's crew trained together until the routines became second nature. They flew practice missions at night and in daylight, sometimes releasing inert shapes that fell toward the desert floor while cameras recorded every detail of their trajectory. The secrecy extended to their families. Letters home were censored, and the men learned to write about the weather and the food and the ordinary complaints of military life while leaving out the one thing that occupied their thoughts. Some of them had wives and children waiting back in the States. Others were young enough that their parents still worried about them as if they were boys. The separation was harder because they could not explain why they were being kept so far from the fighting. They could only say that they were doing important work and that they would come home when it was finished. The letters they received in return were filled with the same careful omissions. No one on either end of those exchanges could speak the truth of what was happening, and the silence became its own kind of bond. When the group was ordered to the island of Tinian in the Marianas, the men packed their gear and climbed aboard their specially modified B-29s for the long flight across the Pacific. The planes had been stripped of most of their defensive armament to make room for the weight of the bomb and the fuel needed for the round trip. The crews knew the mission would be long and that they would be alone over enemy territory for much of the flight. They also knew that once the bomb was released, they would have only a brief window to turn the heavy aircraft and put distance between themselves and the explosion. The training had included practice turns at high speed and low altitude, but no one could be certain how the real weapon would behave once it left the bomb bay. On the morning of the mission, the crew of the Enola Gay gathered in a briefing room that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. Tibbets stood at the front and told them the target for the first time. Hiroshima. He described the city's military importance and the expectation that the bomb would bring a swift end to the war. He did not dwell on the details of what the weapon would do once it reached the ground. The men had seen enough practice bombs and read enough classified reports to understand that the destruction would be unlike anything conventional bombing had achieved. Some of them exchanged glances. Others simply nodded and returned to their checklists. The professionalism of the moment was a shield against the larger questions that could not be asked in that room. The flight itself was long and mostly quiet. The Enola Gay climbed through layers of cloud and leveled off at altitude while the crew ran through their procedures. Gibson moved back to the bomb bay to make the final arming checks, working in the confined space with the steady concentration of a man who had trained for this exact sequence. Lewis kept the plane on course, occasionally glancing at Tibbets, who sat in the left seat with the same calm expression he wore during every long flight. Farabee steadied his charts and the Norden bombsight, waiting for the moment when the target would appear beneath the clouds. The other crew members monitored their instruments and spoke only when necessary. The silence was not tense so much as focused. They had flown enough practice missions to know that the real danger would come in the final minutes before and after the drop. When the weather plane reported that Hiroshima was clear, Tibbets made the decision to proceed. The Enola Gay began its bomb run. Farabee called out the adjustments as the city came into view through the bombsight. At the release point he toggled the switch, and the bomb fell away. The plane lurched upward as the weight left the bomb bay, and Tibbets immediately put the aircraft into the sharp turn they had practiced so many times. The seconds that followed felt longer than any of them had expected. Then the sky behind them lit up with a light brighter than the sun. Even through the tinted goggles they had been given, the flash was blinding. The shock wave caught them seconds later, a hard jolt that shook the heavy bomber and sent a sound like rolling thunder through the fuselage. Lewis, still at the controls, looked back and saw the mushroom cloud rising above the city. He wrote later that it was the most terrifying sight he had ever seen, and that he hoped no one would ever have to see anything like it again. Inside the plane the crew reacted in different ways. Some stared in silence at the cloud that continued to climb and spread. Others spoke quietly among themselves, trying to put words to what they had witnessed. Tibbets kept the plane steady on its return course, his attention divided between the instruments and the sight that filled the rear windows. Jepson, who had seen the device up close in the bomb bay, felt a mixture of relief that the arming sequence had worked and a deep unease about what that success now meant for the people below. The conversation in the cockpit was minimal. There was too much to process, and the long flight back to Tinian gave them time to sit with what they had done. When they landed, the ground crew swarmed the plane, and senior officers were waiting with questions about the mission's success. The crew answered as best they could, describing the flash, the shock wave, and the appearance of the cloud. They were debriefed in detail, then released to rest. Some of them wrote letters that night, trying to capture what they had seen without revealing information that remained classified. Others simply sat in silence or walked the perimeter of the airfield, looking out over the ocean as if the distance could help them make sense of the day. The camaraderie that had carried them through training and the long flight remained, but it had changed. They had shared something that no one else on Earth had experienced, and that shared knowledge created a bond that would last for the rest of their lives. In the weeks and years that followed, the men of the Enola Gay crew returned to ordinary lives that could never again feel entirely ordinary. Some stayed in the military. Others returned to civilian careers. All of them carried the memory of that morning and the sight of the cloud rising over Hiroshima. Some spoke publicly about the mission, describing the professionalism of the crew and the belief that the bomb had helped end the war. Others remained quieter, weighing the human cost against the strategic outcome and finding no easy resolution. Tibbets never expressed regret for the mission itself, but he understood that the men who had flown with him would each have to find their own way to live with what they had witnessed. The plane itself was eventually retired and preserved, a silver artifact of a moment that had changed the relationship between war and technology forever. The harsh, uncensored realities faced by these flight crews, the long hours of secret training, the isolation from family, the split-second decisions over enemy territory, and the lifelong weight of having delivered history's most devastating weapon, are preserved in collections of raw photographs and film that were never meant for wide public viewing. If you want to see the unfiltered faces and conditions behind the official story of the atomic missions, there is a powerful digital collection of unseen war imagery and footage available that shows the true human cost borne by the men who flew those planes. It is the kind of record that helps us understand what it meant to carry that burden across an ocean and back again. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who flew the Atomic Dawn had been trained to treat the mission as a job that required precision and professionalism. They had succeeded in that task. Yet the success brought with it a knowledge that could not be left behind on the island of Tinian or locked away in a classified file. They had seen the world change in a single blinding instant, and they had been the ones who made that change possible. Some would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what that meant for them and for the people who had lived beneath the cloud. Others would simply carry the memory in silence, as one more chapter in a war that had already asked more of them than they had ever expected to give. The silver plane that had carried them across the Pacific returned to its base, but the men inside it had crossed a different kind of threshold, one that no amount of training or distance could ever fully erase. In laboratories and barracks far from the Pacific, men who had built the weapons listened to the radio reports of a second city destroyed and a war finally ending, and found that relief and unease arrived in the same breath. The news reached Los Alamos in fragments at first. Someone had heard on a shortwave radio that another bomb had been dropped, this time on Nagasaki. Then came word that Japan was considering surrender. The men who had spent years turning theory into metal stood in small groups in the corridors and laboratories, passing the information from one to another with the cautious tone of people who had learned not to trust rumors. Oppenheimer was in his office when the first confirmed reports arrived. He listened without interrupting, then walked to the window and stood for a long time looking out over the mesa. The success of the first bomb had already changed the atmosphere on the hill. The second one seemed to confirm that the weapon was no longer an experiment but a tool that would now be used as often as military leaders judged necessary. He did not speak of triumph that afternoon. He spoke instead of the need to understand what had been set in motion and what it would require of the people who had made it possible. At Oak Ridge, the reaction was more immediate and more complicated. The women who had operated the Calatrons and the men who had maintained the massive separation plants heard the news during shift changes or over the loudspeakers that sometimes carried announcements through the dormitories and work buildings. For many of them, the first feeling was relief. The war that had taken husbands and brothers and sons might finally be over. They had contributed to that end in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Yet the relief was quickly followed by questions that had no easy answers. What had the bomb actually done to the cities? How many people had been lost in those final days? And what did it mean that the United States had now used this new power twice in less than a week? Some of the women sat together in the dormitories that evening, sharing what little they knew and trying to picture the places whose names they had only just learned. They wrote letters home that night with the same careful language they had always used, but now the letters carried an undercurrent of something heavier. The work they had done in secret had helped end a war. It had also opened a future that none of them could yet see clearly. At Hanford, the mood was quieter still. The men who had built and operated the reactors that produced the plutonium for the second bomb received the news in the mess halls and the control rooms. They had lived for months with the knowledge that their labor was feeding a weapon whose power they could only imagine. When they heard that Nagasaki had been struck and that Japan was moving toward surrender, some of them felt a fierce pride that their part in the effort had mattered. Others felt a growing unease that would stay with them long after the fences came down and the reactors were shut down for good. One worker later remembered standing at the edge of the site that evening, looking out over the river that had once run clean and thinking about the salmon that would no longer return in the numbers they once had. He did not speak of it to his crew. He simply finished his shift and walked back to his barracks, carrying the same silence that had protected the project from the beginning. The scientists who had worked most closely on the design of the bombs experienced the news in layers. The initial relief that the war might end without an invasion gave way, for some, to a sharper awareness of what had been required to reach that point. They had seen the test in the desert. They had calculated the expected yields and the expected destruction. Now they were hearing reports of actual cities reduced to rubble and ash in a single morning. The difference between a test and a city full of people was not something that could be measured in equations. It was something that had to be carried in the mind and the conscience. Oppenheimer received letters in the days after Nagasaki from colleagues who had not been at Trinity, letters that asked whether there had been another way. He answered them as honestly as the constraints of secrecy and his own uncertainty allowed. He believed the bombs had shortened the war. He also understood that the world would now live with the knowledge that such weapons existed and could be used again. The surrender of Japan brought a different kind of release. In the project sites, the announcement was met with a mixture of celebration and reflection. At Los Alamos, some of the younger scientists organized an impromptu gathering in one of the laboratories, sharing whatever food and drink they could find and speaking in low voices about what the end of the war would mean for their own futures. Others chose to spend the evening alone or with close friends, trying to sort through feelings that did not fit easily into categories of victory or defeat. At Oak Ridge, the women who had kept the Calatrons running through long shifts allowed themselves a moment of genuine relief. The work that had required so much secrecy and so many personal sacrifices had contributed to an outcome that would bring soldiers home. Yet even in the midst of that relief, there were conversations about what the future would hold now that the bomb had been used. Some wondered whether the knowledge they had helped create would make future wars more terrible rather than less. Others simply wanted to go home and try to return to lives that had been interrupted for so long. The emotional consequences of those final days accumulated in small, private ways. A physicist at Los Alamos wrote to his wife that he felt both proud and ashamed in the same moment. proud that the weapon had helped end a brutal war and ashamed that it had required the destruction of entire cities to do so. A worker at Hanford received a letter from his brother who had been fighting in the Pacific and who wrote that the news of the bombs had reached his unit with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The brother described seeing the faces of men who had expected to take part in an invasion and who now believed they might live to see their families again. That letter sat on the worker's shelf for years afterward, a reminder that the decisions made in Washington and the labor performed in the desert had touched lives in ways that could never be fully calculated. There were moments of quiet kindness that helped the project communities process what had happened. At Los Alamos, a group of scientists who had worked together on the implosion design met in one of their homes and simply sat together without speaking for a long time. The silence was not empty. It was a recognition that they had shared something that no one outside the project could fully understand and that they would need one another's presence in the years ahead. At Oak Ridge, women who had operated the same machines for months took turns checking on one another, making sure that those who seemed most troubled had someone to talk to or simply sit with. These small acts did not change the larger reality of what had been done, but they made it possible for people to carry the weight without being entirely alone. The dedication required to preserve the complex emotional aftermath of those days, to listen to the voices of those who lived through the end of the war and the beginning of something new, is the same dedication that keeps these stories alive when the world prefers to move on. If these accounts of ordinary people carrying the consequences of extraordinary decisions have meant something to you, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told with care and depth, I would be truly grateful for any support you can offer through Ko-Fi. Even a small tip, as little as $1, helps sustain the research and the time it takes to bring these hidden chapters forward. It is a simple way to say that remembering the full human cost matters. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the weeks after the surrender, the project sites began the slow process of winding down or shifting to new purposes. Some of the scientists returned to universities and laboratories where they would spend the rest of their careers trying to understand the forces they had helped unleash. Others stayed with the government work that had now become permanent. The workers at Oak Ridge and Hanford who had lived for so long inside classified worlds began to imagine what it would be like to speak openly about what they had done. Most of them would never be able to tell the full story. The secrecy that had protected the project continued to shape their lives long after the bombs had fallen and the war had ended. Yet even in the midst of that continuing silence, there was a shared understanding that something irreversible had occurred. The men and women who had built the weapons and flown the missions and made the decisions had crossed a threshold together. They had helped end one war and, in doing so, had opened the door to a future in which the power they had created would shape every conflict and every hope for peace that followed. The relief that came with the surrender was real. The questions that came with it would never entirely go away. In the laboratories of Los Alamos, a soft-spoken refugee physicist worked alongside his colleagues by day and met with Soviet contacts by night, carrying in his mind the knowledge that could change the balance of power forever. Klaus Fuchs had arrived in the United States as part of the British scientific mission, a quiet man with a precise mind and a past shaped by the rise of fascism in his native Germany. He had fled Nazi persecution, first to Britain and then, after a brief internment as an enemy alien, into the heart of the Allied effort to build the atomic bomb. His colleagues at Los Alamos knew him as reliable, brilliant at the complex calculations required for the implosion design, and unfailingly polite in the long hours of collaborative work. What they did not know was that Fuchs had already decided, years earlier, that the weapon being created must not remain the exclusive property of any single nation. He believed with quiet conviction that the Soviet Union, as an ally in the fight against Hitler, had a right to the same knowledge that was being developed in the desert laboratories of New Mexico. Fuchs' decision to pass information had begun long before he reached Los Alamos. While working in Britain on the early theoretical work, he had made contact with a Soviet agent and begun providing details of the research. By the time he was selected for the British team sent to the United States, he had already crossed the line from scientist to informant. At Los Alamos, he was given access to some of the most sensitive aspects of the plutonium bomb design. He attended meetings where the challenges of implosion were discussed in detail. He worked on the calculations that determined how the explosive lenses would compress the plutonium core. He saw the reports on the expected yield and the problems that still needed solving. Each piece of information he absorbed during the day became material he could pass along during carefully arranged meetings away from the site. The meetings took place in Santa Fe or on quiet roads outside the restricted area. Fuchs would drive or walk to a predetermined spot, exchange information with his contact, and return to the laboratory as if nothing had happened. He carried no documents when he could avoid it, preferring to commit details to memory and reproduce them later. His handlers were impressed by his precision and his calm. He never appeared nervous, never asked for payment, and never seemed to doubt the rightness of what he was doing. In his own mind, Fuchs framed the choice as a moral one. He had seen what unchecked power could do in the hands of a fascist regime. He believed that allowing any single nation, even an ally, to hold a monopoly on such a weapon would inevitably lead to another war. Sharing the information with the Soviet Union was, in his view, a way to restore balance and reduce the chance that the bomb would ever be used again. His colleagues at Los Alamos had no reason to suspect him. Fuchs was respected for his work and liked for his quiet demeanor. He joined in the occasional social gatherings on the Hill, though he kept mostly to himself. He wrote letters to his sister in Switzerland and to friends in Britain, letters that were read by censors but revealed nothing of his other life. The double existence he led required a particular kind of discipline. During the day he contributed to the effort to solve the technical problems of the bomb. At night or on weekends he met with men whose names he often did not know and passed along information that would eventually help another nation build its own weapon. The strain of that separation showed only in small ways. He sometimes seemed more tired than his workload would explain. He occasionally withdrew into long silences during conversations that touched on politics or the future of the world after the war. Those who noticed these moments attributed them to the general pressure of the work rather than to any deeper conflict. The revelation of Fuchs' activities came years after the war had ended. British intelligence, following leads from decrypted Soviet communications, identified him as a possible source. When confronted, Fuchs did not deny what he had done. He confessed calmly and in detail, describing the meetings, the information he had passed, and the reasons he had given himself for doing so. He expressed no remorse for the act itself, only a quiet acceptance that he had broken the laws of the country that had given him refuge. His confession sent shock waves through the scientific community that had once trusted him. Colleagues who had worked beside him at Los Alamos and in Britain struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the man who had systematically betrayed their shared effort. Some felt a profound sense of personal violation, as if a friend had been stolen from them. Others wondered how they could have missed the signs, how a man so integral to the team could have maintained such a complete separation between his public and private selves. The damage extended beyond the personal. The discovery that a scientist with access to the most sensitive aspects of the bomb design had been reporting to the Soviet Union accelerated the already growing suspicion between the wartime allies. It contributed to the tightening of security procedures in the American nuclear program and to the broader climate of fear that would soon be called the Red Scare. Scientists who had once moved freely between laboratories in different countries now found themselves subject to intense scrutiny. Friendships that had formed during the urgent days of the Manhattan Project were re-examined in light of new fears about loyalty and ideology. The trust that had allowed brilliant minds from many nations to work together toward a common goal had been broken, and the pieces would not easily be reassembled. For Fuchs himself, the years after his confession were marked by a strange mixture of consequences. He was tried in Britain, sentenced to prison, and eventually released. He returned to East Germany, where he continued his scientific work under a regime that viewed him as a hero rather than a traitor. In letters and interviews later in his life, he continued to defend his actions as necessary to prevent a nuclear monopoly that could have led to catastrophe. He never expressed regret for the choice he had made, though he acknowledged the personal cost to the colleagues who had trusted him. The men and women who had once shared laboratories and late-night discussions with him were left to carry their own versions of that cost. Some never spoke of Fuchs again. Others found themselves unable to fully trust new colleagues or new security arrangements. The mole in the heart of the project had done more than pass information. He had planted a seed of doubt that would grow for decades in the soil of scientific collaboration and international relations. The deep betrayal, the ideological conviction that drove one man to divide his loyalties while working among trusted colleagues, and the shattered sense of trust that followed the revelation, are exactly the kinds of stories that deserve to be explored without limits or filters. On my Patreon, you'll find free podcasts that go deeper into these moments of espionage and divided allegiance inside the Manhattan Project, raw and unblurred video sections that show the faces and the laboratories behind the names, and a growing community of people who care about remembering how ordinary human beings made extraordinary and sometimes devastating choices. It's also a place where you can support the work directly through the tip jar if these stories matter to you. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to discover that someone you worked beside every day had been carrying your shared secrets to another nation, the deeper conversations are waiting there. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The discovery of Klaus Fuchs and the smaller network of other informants who had operated within the Manhattan Project marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The wartime alliance that had brought scientists from many countries together in the desert laboratories of New Mexico could not survive the knowledge that some of those same scientists had been reporting to a nation that would soon become an adversary. The trust that had made the rapid progress of the project possible was replaced by procedures and suspicions that would shape the Cold War years. Fuchs himself became a symbol of the dangers that lurked inside even the most carefully guarded secrets. His colleagues, many of whom had dedicated years of their lives to the effort, were left to reckon with the fact that the weapon they had built to defeat one enemy had already begun to divide the victors before the war was fully over. The mole in the heart of the project had done his work quietly and effectively. The consequences of that work would echo through the scientific community and through the larger world for generations to come. In a windowless room in Washington, the man who had once stood at the center of the greatest scientific endeavor in history now sat alone at a table while former colleagues and friends took the stand to question his loyalty and his judgment. J. Robert Oppenheimer had spent the years after the war trying to shape the future of atomic energy in ways that would prevent another arms race. He had advised presidents and military leaders, served on influential boards, and spoken publicly about the need for international control of nuclear weapons. His voice carried weight because he had led the effort that produced the bomb. Yet that same voice had also made him enemies. He had opposed the crash program to build the hydrogen bomb, arguing that the weapon was unnecessary and that its development would only accelerate a dangerous competition with the Soviet Union. He had questioned the wisdom of certain security policies and had maintained friendships with people whose political views were now viewed with deep suspicion. In the climate of the early 1950s, those positions and those associations became liabilities. The security hearing that began in April 1954 was presented as a routine review of Oppenheimer's clearance. In reality, it was something closer to a trial. The charges centered on his past associations with communists and communist sympathizers during the 1930s and 1940s, on his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, and on his truthfulness in earlier investigations. Oppenheimer sat through weeks of testimony, listening as men he had worked beside during the war described his character and his decisions in ways that made him seem untrustworthy or even dangerous. Edward Teller, who had once benefited from Oppenheimer's support at Los Alamos, took the stand and stated that he would feel safer if Oppenheimer's access to classified information were revoked. The words landed with particular force because Teller had been a colleague and, in some ways, a protege. Oppenheimer had championed Teller's work on the hydrogen bomb even while disagreeing with the urgency of its development. Now that same work was being used to cast doubt on Oppenheimer's judgment and loyalty. The hearing room itself was small and airless, with long tables and uncomfortable chairs. Oppenheimer sat at one end, often with his head slightly bowed, his hands folded in front of him. He answered questions in the same precise, slightly formal voice he had always used, but those who knew him well could see the strain. His wife Kitty attended many of the sessions, sitting behind him and offering what support she could in glances and quiet words during breaks. Their children were older now, but the family still felt the weight of the proceedings. Oppenheimer had always carried his responsibilities with a kind of poetic intensity. Now that intensity was turned inward, focused on surviving an ordeal that seemed designed to dismantle the public role he had built since the war. The testimony revealed how completely the world had changed since the urgent days of Los Alamos. Scientists who had once shared late-night conversations about physics and philosophy now spoke in the careful language of security clearances and political reliability. Some defended Oppenheimer, describing his leadership during the war and his commitment to preventing the misuse of atomic energy. Others, whether out of conviction or self-protection, emphasized his past associations and his resistance to certain policies. The cumulative effect was to paint a picture of a man who had been brilliant but naive, influential but unreliable. Oppenheimer listened to it all without visible anger. He had spent years navigating the tensions between science and government. He understood that the hearing was less about any single charge than about the broader fear that had taken hold of the country. There were moments of particular pain. When former colleagues described conversations or decisions from years earlier in ways that made them sound suspicious, Oppenheimer sometimes corrected the record with quiet precision. He did not raise his voice or accuse anyone of betrayal. He simply stated what he remembered and what he had believed at the time. The dignity of his responses only made the proceedings more difficult to watch for those who still admired him. One observer later wrote that it felt as though the room itself was shrinking around Oppenheimer, closing off the space he had once occupied in the scientific and political world. The man who had helped win the war was now being asked to prove that he had not been working against his own country all along. The personal cost extended beyond the hearing room. Oppenheimer's health had never been robust, and the stress of the proceedings took a visible toll. He smoked more heavily than before and slept poorly. Kitty managed the household and tried to shield their children from the worst of the public attention, but the family could not escape the sense that something fundamental was being taken from them. Oppenheimer had always found meaning in his work and in his ability to influence policy. Now that influence was being stripped away in real time, piece by piece, through the testimony of men who had once sought his advice. The irony was not lost on him. He had led an effort that required absolute trust among colleagues from many nations and many political backgrounds. Now that same effort was being used to question whether he himself could be trusted. When the hearing concluded, the board recommended that Oppenheimer's security clearance be revoked. The decision was not unanimous, but the majority view prevailed. Oppenheimer accepted the outcome with the same outward calm he had maintained throughout. In private, he spoke with friends about the sense of loss, not only for himself but for the scientific community that had once believed it could advise the government without becoming entangled in political suspicion. He continued to teach and to write, but the public role he had played since the war was effectively over. The father of the bomb had been judged and found wanting by the very system he had helped to create. The broader context of those months revealed how far the country had moved from the wartime spirit of urgent collaboration. The fear of Soviet espionage, fueled by cases like that of Klaus Fuchs, had created an atmosphere in which past associations and political disagreements could be transformed into evidence of disloyalty. Scientists who had once been celebrated as heroes of the war effort now found themselves required to navigate loyalty oaths and security investigations that treated independent thought as a potential threat. Oppenheimer's hearing became the most visible example of this shift. It demonstrated that even the man most closely associated with the atomic bomb could be cast as a risk if his views diverged from the prevailing policy direction. The lesson was not lost on other scientists. Many became more cautious in their public statements. Some withdrew from government service altogether. The community that had once worked together across ideological lines had been fractured by the same forces it had helped to unleash. There were small acts of support that mattered in those difficult months. Colleagues who could not speak publicly still wrote private letters of encouragement. Students and former students reached out to express their continued respect. Oppenheimer's family remained a steady presence, offering the kind of quiet resilience that had always been part of their life together. These gestures did not change the outcome of the hearing, but they reminded Oppenheimer that he was not entirely alone in carrying the consequences. He responded to each one with the same careful attention he had always given to personal correspondence, as if maintaining those connections was one of the few things still within his control. The hidden personal costs of that period, the forgotten principles of scientific independence that were tested and sometimes broken, and the shadow war of loyalty and paranoia that reshaped the lives of men and women who had once believed their work served only the cause of peace, are exactly the kinds of stories that deserve to be remembered in full. There is a powerful free ebook called The Shadow War: 5 Top-Secret Operations That Shaped World War II that explores more of these hidden missions and the people who lived through the transition from wartime urgency to post-war suspicion, along with weekly deep dives into the human side of the conflicts that defined an era. If the story of Oppenheimer's hearing and the broader climate that made it possible has stayed with you, the ebook and the newsletter are a wonderful way to keep exploring the deeper layers of what was asked of scientists and citizens in those years. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the years that followed the hearing, Oppenheimer continued to live and work, but the public figure who had once commanded attention in the highest circles of government was gone. He accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he could focus on physics and on mentoring younger scientists without the constant pressure of political scrutiny. He spoke less about policy and more about the responsibilities of knowledge itself. The man who had once led the effort to build the bomb now spent his days trying to understand what that effort had meant for the world and for the people who had made it possible. The trial had broken something in him, but it had not extinguished the quiet determination that had always been part of his character. He carried the memory of the hearing and the sense of betrayal that came with it, yet he also carried the knowledge that his contributions to science and to the war effort remained part of the historical record. The father of the bomb had fallen from official grace, but the questions he had raised about the future of nuclear weapons and the relationship between science and power continued to echo long after the hearing room had emptied. In quiet offices and laboratories across the country, men who had once raced to build the first atomic bomb now watched as their creation sparked an even more terrifying competition, one that promised not single cities destroyed but entire civilizations erased in an instant. The Soviet test in 1949 arrived like a sudden storm. American scientists who had believed their country held a decisive lead suddenly faced the reality that the knowledge they had developed in secret was no longer theirs alone. The shock rippled through the community that had worked at Los Alamos and the other project sites. Some felt a grim satisfaction that the balance of power had been restored, believing that mutual deterrence might prevent future wars. Others felt only dread. They had seen what one bomb could do. The idea that another nation now possessed the same power, and might soon possess even greater power, turned the victory of 1945 into something far more complicated. The genie they had released could not be coaxed back into the bottle, and every new development seemed to make the world smaller and more dangerous. Edward Teller had never been content with the fission bomb alone. Even during the war he had pushed for work on a weapon that would harness the power of fusion, releasing energy on a scale that made the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs seem modest by comparison. After the Soviet test, Teller found powerful allies. The political climate had shifted dramatically. The fear of Soviet expansion, combined with the knowledge that the United States no longer held a monopoly, created an opening for those who argued that only a crash program to build the hydrogen bomb could restore American security. Tiller became the public face of that argument. He spoke with urgency and conviction, describing a future in which the Soviet Union might develop weapons far more powerful than anything the United States possessed. His persistence, combined with the broader atmosphere of anxiety, eventually convinced President Truman to authorize a full-scale effort. Oppenheimer viewed the same developments with deep concern. He had spent the years after the war advocating for international control of atomic energy and for limits on the development of ever more destructive weapons. He believed that the hydrogen bomb would not enhance security but would instead guarantee an endless and increasingly catastrophic arms race. In meetings and in private conversations, he argued against the crash program, warning that the weapon's only real purpose would be the destruction of civilian populations on a scale previously unimaginable. His position put him at odds with Tiller and with growing segments of the military and political establishment. The same man who had led the effort to build the first bomb now found himself cast as an obstacle to what many viewed as the necessary next step. The personal and professional cost of that stance would become clear in the years that followed. The scientists who had worked together at Los Alamos experienced the new race in different ways. Some, like Ernest Lawrence, supported the hydrogen bomb program and contributed to the technical efforts required to make it possible. Others shared Oppenheimer's doubts but felt powerless to slow the momentum. The community that had once been bound by the urgent need to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan now found itself divided by questions about what should come next. Friendships that had survived the intense pressures of the war began to strain under the weight of these new disagreements. Late-night conversations that had once centered on physics now turned to politics and morality, and the old camaraderie was harder to recover. The technical challenge of the hydrogen bomb was enormous. Unlike the fission weapons, which relied on splitting heavy atoms, a fusion weapon would require the joining of light atoms under conditions of extreme temperature and pressure. The only practical way to achieve those conditions was to use a fission bomb as a trigger. The design problems were fiendishly complex, involving questions of radiation flow, compression, and the behavior of materials under conditions that had never been created on Earth. Tiller worked tirelessly on these problems, often in collaboration with the mathematician Stanislaw Ulam. Their eventual breakthrough, the Teller-Ulam configuration, provided a path forward that made the weapon feasible. The achievement was celebrated by those who believed the hydrogen bomb was essential for national security. For others, it represented another step down a path that could only lead to greater danger. The personal transformations among the key figures were profound. Tiller, who had once been seen as something of an outsider even within the scientific community, rose to prominence as the champion of the new weapon. His energy and determination won him both admirers and critics. Oppenheimer, by contrast, found his influence waning. His opposition to the hydrogen bomb, combined with his earlier political associations and his advocacy for arms control, made him a target in the increasingly suspicious atmosphere of the early Cold War. The security hearing that would strip him of his clearance in 1954 was already casting its shadow. The man who had once been celebrated as the father of the atomic bomb was now viewed by some as a liability in the new struggle. Ordinary families across the United States and around the world experienced the escalation in more immediate ways. Civil defense programs taught children to duck and cover under their desks. Families built fallout shelters in backyards and stocked them with supplies. The language of everyday life began to include terms like megaton and overkill and mutual assured destruction. The fear was not always spoken aloud, but it shaped decisions about where to live, how to raise children, and what kind of future seemed possible. Parents who had lived through the Second World War now faced the prospect that their children might inherit a world in which total destruction could arrive without warning. The scientists who had helped create that world carried their own version of that anxiety. Many of them had children of their own. They understood better than most what the weapons could do, and that knowledge made the arms race feel personal rather than abstract. There were moments of quiet resilience amid the growing tension. Scientists who disagreed about policy still collaborated on research that had civilian applications. Families found ways to maintain ordinary routines even as the larger world grew more frightening. Letters between former colleagues sometimes bridged political divides, carrying news of children and health and the small details of daily life. These connections did not stop the arms race, but they reminded people that the human relationships formed during the war had not entirely disappeared. The bonds that had been forged under the pressure of building the first bomb proved stronger than some of the disagreements that followed. The global fear that settled over families living under the constant shadow of annihilation was perhaps the most lasting consequence of the transition from one bomb to many. The Manhattan Project had been justified as a necessary response to the threat of Nazi Germany. Once that threat had been defeated, the logic of ever-increasing destructive power took on a momentum of its own. Each new development on one side prompted a response on the other. The hydrogen bomb was followed by more powerful versions, by intercontinental missiles, by submarine-launched weapons, and by the constant refinement of delivery systems. The scientists who had once believed their work might end all wars now found themselves living in a world where the threat of war had simply changed form. Some continued to advocate for limits and for dialogue. Others concluded that the only realistic path was to ensure their own side maintained an advantage. The personal cost of these choices varied, but few escaped the sense that the future had become more uncertain than it had ever been before. Just as these scientists and their families lived through the transition from the Second World War into the long shadow of the Cold War, there are powerful stories from that same era that continue to remind us of the human cost and the quiet courage required of those who bore the heaviest loads. If you want to connect more deeply with the courage of ordinary people and leaders who faced impossible odds during the war and its aftermath, I can't recommend highly enough exploring authentic World War II memorabilia or watching the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which brings to life the personal dramas and sacrifices of the Pacific Campaign in a way that stays with you. These are the kinds of resources that honor the past while helping us understand what was truly at stake as the world moved from one conflict into another. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the first hydrogen bomb was tested in the early 1950s, the world had already changed in ways that no one involved in the original Manhattan Project could have fully anticipated. The single bomb that had ended the war against Japan had become the first step in an arms race that would consume enormous resources and generate constant anxiety for decades. The men and women who had helped build that first bomb found themselves on different sides of the debates that followed. Some continued to believe that the knowledge they had created could be managed and controlled. Others concluded that the only realistic response was to prepare for the worst. The personal transformations, the political pressures, and the growing fear that settled over families around the world were all part of the same story. The genie that had been released in the desert in 1945 had grown far beyond the control of any single nation or any single group of scientists. The challenge now was not simply to understand the power that had been unleashed, but to live with it, day after day, in a world where the possibility of annihilation had become a permanent part of the human condition. Decades after the desert lit up and the cities fell silent, the descendants of those who built the bomb and those who survived its use now stand together, asking what we owe the generations yet to come. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have carried their stories for more than 80 years. Many were children when the sky turned white and the world around them vanished into heat and wind and silence. They have spoken of the flash that erased shadows, of the black rain that fell afterward, of the burns that never fully healed and the illnesses that arrived years later without warning. Their accounts are not abstract warnings. They are the lived memory of what the Manhattan Project ultimately produced. One woman who was 8 years old in Hiroshima has described walking through streets where the only sound was the crackle of fire and the cries of people she could no longer recognize. She has spent her life telling that story to anyone who would listen, because she believes the only way to prevent it from happening again is to make sure the world cannot look away. Her voice carries both the weight of what she endured and a quiet determination that her suffering might still serve some larger purpose. The descendants of the scientists who built the bomb have inherited a different but equally complicated legacy. Oppenheimer's daughter has spoken of growing up in the shadow of a father whose public achievements were matched by private torment. She has described the way his opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his later security hearing shaped the family's life long after the war ended. She has also spoken of his deep love for the natural world and his belief that science carried moral responsibilities that could not be set aside. These are not the stories of a triumphant inventor. They are the stories of a man who understood too late that knowledge and power are never neutral. His grandchildren have carried the same questions forward, wondering what it means to be connected to an event that changed the moral landscape of the 20th century. They have chosen to speak openly about both the brilliance and the burden, refusing to let the narrative settle into either simple celebration or simple condemnation. Modern scientists who work in the same fields have their own reflections on what the Manhattan Project means today. Some have spent their careers trying to reduce the risks that the original project created. They advocate for treaties that limit nuclear arsenals, for verification systems that build trust between nations, and for open scientific exchange that makes secret weapons programs harder to hide. Others have chosen to focus on civilian applications of nuclear technology, arguing that the same knowledge that produced weapons can also provide energy and medical advances if guided by different priorities. All of them live with the awareness that the threshold crossed in 1945 has never been uncrossed. Every new development in physics or engineering carries with it the memory of what happened when brilliant minds worked in isolation and secrecy toward a single destructive goal. The human capacity for both creation and destruction has never been more visible than in the story of the Manhattan Project. The same impulse that drove scientists to understand the structure of the atom also drove them to turn that understanding into a weapon of unprecedented power. The same nation that mobilized its resources to defeat fascism also created a device that would later threaten the survival of civilization itself. The survivors of the bombings and the descendants of the scientists have both learned, in different ways, that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous and that power without restraint eventually consumes those who wield it. These are not abstract lessons. They are the accumulated experience of people who lived through the birth of the nuclear age and who have spent the rest of their lives trying to prevent its worst possibilities from becoming reality. There have been moments of genuine reconciliation and shared purpose that offer some hope. Survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki have met with veterans who flew the missions and with scientists who worked on the project. These encounters have not always been easy. They have required courage on all sides to sit together and speak honestly about what happened and why. Yet many of those who have participated describe a sense of relief that comes from breaking the silence that once separated them. A survivor who lost her family in Nagasaki has spoken of meeting the daughter of a scientist who helped design the bomb. Their conversation did not erase the past, but it created a small space where both women could acknowledge the human cost on each side and commit to working against any future use of such weapons. These moments of connection do not change the historical record, but they demonstrate that even the deepest divisions can sometimes be bridged by the simple act of listening. The enduring lesson of the Manhattan Project is that science and technology are never separate from the moral choices of the societies that develop them. The men and women who worked in the desert laboratories believed they were racing against an enemy that would stop at nothing to achieve victory. Many of them later came to understand that the same urgency that justified their work also created pressures that made it difficult to ask whether the work should be done at all. The secrecy that protected the project from discovery also protected it from the kind of public debate that might have slowed its progress or altered its direction. The scientists who later opposed the hydrogen bomb and advocated for arms control were in many cases the same people who had once accepted the necessity of the original weapon. Their change of heart came from seeing what their creation had unleashed and from recognizing that the logic of escalation has no natural stopping point. The global fear that has accompanied the nuclear age is not only a fear of weapons. It is also a fear of forgetting. The survivors who continue to speak, the descendants who continue to reflect, and the scientists who continue to warn are all engaged in the same essential work. They are insisting that the story of the Manhattan Project remains part of living memory rather than fading into the comfortable distance of history. They understand that new generations will face their own versions of the same questions. They know that the temptation to pursue power without fully reckoning with its consequences will not disappear simply because the original bomb has receded into the past. The only defense against that temptation is the persistent, sometimes uncomfortable act of remembering. The harsh, uncensored long-term realities of what was created in those desert laboratories and what was unleashed over those two cities, along with the enduring human lessons about the responsibilities that come with knowledge and power, are preserved in collections of raw photographs and film that were never intended for public display. If you want to see the unfiltered faces of survivors and scientists, the ruined landscapes, and the quiet moments of reflection that official histories often leave out, there is a powerful digital collection of unseen imagery and footage available that brings those realities forward without softening or sanitizing them. It is the kind of record that helps us understand what we truly owe the future. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What we owe the future is not certainty that such weapons will never be used again. Certainty is not available to us. What we owe is the sustained effort to remember why they were built in the first place, what they cost in human terms, and what they continue to cost in the form of constant vigilance and diverted resources. We owe the survivors the dignity of being heard rather than pitied or forgotten. We owe the descendants of the scientists the honesty of acknowledging both the achievement and the moral complexity of what their ancestors created. We owe the scientists working today the recognition that their choices matter and that the example of those who came before them offers both warning and inspiration. Most of all, we owe the generations who will inherit this world the simple act of refusing to treat the nuclear age as inevitable or unchangeable. The story of the Manhattan Project is not only a story about the past. It is a story about the present choices that will determine whether the threshold crossed in 1945 remains a permanent feature of human existence or becomes a cautionary chapter in a longer history of learning to live with the power we have created. The desert still holds the memory of that first fire. The cities still hold the memory of what followed. The people who carry those memories forward are asking us to listen, to reflect, and to act as though the future is still ours to shape.